You've been lied to about who you are. They told you that if you feel stuck, confused, or overwhelmed, it means something is wrong with you. That if you're still healing, still searching, still struggling, then you must be broken. But if that were true, why do so many people who claim to be fixed still feel empty? Why does improvement sometimes feel like pressure instead of peace? Why does trying to become better often make you feel further from yourself? The truth is simple. You are not broken. You are becoming. Buddhist wisdom has whispered this truth for centuries, not through force or perfection, but through awareness, acceptance, and compassion. The Buddha never taught that you must repair yourself. He taught that understanding yourself is the transformation. These teachings are not about escaping who you are. They are about staying present with what is unfolding, about learning to sit with discomfort without turning it into self-judgment, about seeing change as something natural, not something you must earn. As you listen, your inner resistance will begin to soften. The voice that says you should be further along will grow quieter. The tension of trying to arrive will slowly loosen its grip. You may start to feel something different, not excitement, but relief. The relief of realizing that growth does not require violence against yourself. This is not a message about becoming perfect. It is about becoming honest, about allowing yourself to evolve without shame, about recognizing that every phase you are in has a purpose. This is not something to consume and forget. It is a reminder, a remembering, that you were never behind, you were never defective, you were always becoming. If you are ready to see yourself with softer eyes and walk the path of personal transformation without self-rejection, let's begin. Before we go deeper, something needs to be acknowledged. If you stayed with the introduction and felt a quiet recognition rather than excitement, that matters. That feeling is not inspiration, it is resonance. It means something inside you already knows what is coming next. And now, instead of moving forward with confidence, this is usually where discomfort shows up. The mind tightens, the body resists. Old questions return. This is not a mistake, this is the doorway. Discomfort is often the first thing we try to remove when we begin any inner path. We look for calm, clarity, peace, relief. But before any of those appear, something else comes first. Friction, unease, restlessness, a sense that something inside no longer fits the way it used to. Most people interpret this as failure. Buddhism does not. Buddhism sees this moment as sacred. Discomfort is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that something false can no longer stay comfortable. When the mind begins to wake up, it loses its ability to numb itself the way it once did. Old distractions stop working. Old explanations feel thin. Old identities begin to crack. This does not feel peaceful. It feels confusing. It feels destabilizing. But this destabilization is not destruction. It is reorganization. In Buddhist thought, awakening is not a pleasant upgrade to life. It is a disruption of illusion. And illusion does not leave quietly. It resists. It creates tension. That tension is what you are feeling when discomfort arises. The friction is not between you and life. It is between truth and the stories you have been using to survive. Pain, in this view, is not punishment. It is pressure. Just as a seed must split before it can grow, the inner structures that once kept you safe must loosen before something more honest can form. The shell does not break because it is bad. It breaks because it has completed its job. Discomfort signals completion, not deficiency. Modern culture treats pain as an error message, something to fix, suppress, or escape. Buddhism treats pain as information. Not all pain, but especially the pain that appears when you stop running, the ache that comes when you sit still, the heaviness that surfaces when you stop distracting yourself. This pain is not asking you to disappear. It is asking you to listen. Inner friction arises when the way you live no longer matches the way you see. You may notice that certain conversations exhaust you more than before. Certain habits feel empty. Certain goals no longer motivate you. This creates discomfort because the mind wants continuity. It wants to keep moving forward without changing direction. But awareness does not allow this. Once you see clearly, you cannot unsee. And what you can no longer unsee begins to press against you from the inside. This pressure is evolutionary, not in the biological sense, but in the psychological and spiritual sense. You are being shaped by what no longer works. Buddhism does not promise comfort, it promises clarity, and clarity often feels uncomfortable before it feels freeing. There is a teaching in Buddhism that suffering arises from resistance. But this does not mean that discomfort itself is suffering. The suffering comes from arguing with what is already happening inside you. When sadness appears and you tell yourself you should not feel sad, suffering is created. When confusion appears and you demand certainty, suffering multiplies. Discomfort itself is neutral. It becomes suffering only when it is interpreted as failure. This is why so many people feel broken when they begin to wake up. They assume that growth should feel better immediately. They expect peace without disruption. But peace is not the absence of disturbance. It is the absence of resistance to disturbance. And that capacity is built through contact with discomfort, not avoidance of it. In Buddhist practice, sitting meditation often brings discomfort to the surface. Not because meditation causes pain, but because it removes the noise that was covering it. When the body aches, when the mind wanders, when impatience arises, the instruction is not to escape. It is to observe, to stay, to soften around the sensation instead of tightening against it. This trains a radical skill, the ability to remain present with what is unpleasant without turning it into a problem. This skill changes everything. When you no longer treat discomfort as an emergency, it stops controlling you. It still exists, but it no longer defines you. You begin to see that discomfort is temporary, shifting, alive. It comes, it changes, it passes. What remains is awareness itself, stable, open, not threatened. Discomfort also exposes attachment. You feel pain not only because something hurts, but because you want it to stop. You want resolution. You want certainty. You want relief. Buddhism does not condemn this desire, but it invites you to examine it. What are you demanding from the moment that it cannot give? What are you trying to force into a shape that no longer fits? When you stop demanding that discomfort disappear, it begins to teach you. It shows you where you are gripping, where you are afraid, where you are clinging to an identity that is dissolving. This is not regression, it is refinement. There is a quiet violence in the way people talk about healing, as if pain means something is wrong, as if struggle is a defect. This mindset creates a second layer of suffering, the pain of pain plus the shame of having it. Buddhism removes this second layer. Pain is not proof that you are failing. It is proof that you are alive and responsive. Inner friction is the meeting point between who you have been and who you can no longer avoid becoming. That meeting is awkward. It is unstable. It feels like standing between two worlds. The old one is familiar, but hollow. The new one is real, but unclear. Most people retreat at this point. They go back to what numbs them. Buddhism encourages you to stay. Staying does not mean forcing insight. It means allowing experience to unfold without judgment. When discomfort is allowed to exist without resistance, it often transforms on its own, not into pleasure, but into understanding. You see why it arose. You see what it is connected to. You see that it is not personal. It is conditional. This understanding brings compassion. Not the sentimental kind, but the grounded kind. You stop treating yourself as a project that failed. You start treating yourself as a process that is honest. Compassion grows not because pain disappears, but because you stop abandoning yourself when pain appears. Discomfort also slows you down. It interrupts momentum. It forces you to question direction. This is essential. Growth that never pauses becomes mechanical. Discomfort creates space. In that space, choice becomes possible. You can see what you have been doing automatically. You can decide whether it still serves you. Buddhism frames this as awakening not to bliss, but to reality. Reality includes uncertainty. It includes loss. It includes change. When you resist these, discomfort intensifies. When you allow them, discomfort becomes bearable, even meaningful. There is also a humility that discomfort brings. It strips away the fantasy of control. It shows you that growth is not something you dominate. It is something you cooperate with. This humility is not weakness. It is alignment. You stop trying to outrun your own unfolding. Over time, the relationship with discomfort changes. It no longer feels like an enemy. It feels like a signal, a messenger, not one that speaks clearly at first, but one that becomes easier to understand the more you listen. You learn to ask different questions, not, how do I get rid of this, but what is being asked of me right now? Sometimes the answer is rest. Sometimes it is honesty. Sometimes it is letting go. Sometimes it is staying longer than you want to. Discomfort does not give the same lesson twice in the same way. It evolves as you do. This is why Buddhism does not rush awakening. It respects timing. It respects integration. A sudden insight without the capacity to hold it can destabilize a person. Discomfort builds that capacity. It strengthens the nervous system's ability to remain open under pressure. It teaches patience, not as endurance, but as presence. Eventually, you may notice something unexpected. The discomfort that once felt overwhelming now feels workable. Not gone, but navigable. You trust yourself more. Not because life is easier, but because you know you can stay with it. This trust is not confidence. It is intimacy with experience. You are no longer at war with what arises. You meet it, and in meeting it, you continue becoming. This is the sacred function of discomfort, not to punish you, not to prove you are broken, but to apply just enough pressure to reveal what is real. And what is real does not need fixing, it needs space. As this understanding settles, something subtle shifts. You stop measuring growth by how good you feel. You start recognizing growth by how honestly you can remain. Discomfort no longer signals failure, it signals movement. And from this movement something else begins to emerge, not answers but depth, not certainty but steadiness. The path does not smooth out, but you no longer need it to. This is how awakening begins. Not with light, but with friction. Not with relief, but with truth. And truth, once allowed, carries you forward whether you are ready or not. You are not broken. You are becoming. As discomfort loosens its grip and stops being something you fight against, a quiet pause appears. Not relief, not answers, just space. And for many people, this is the most unsettling phase of all. The struggle has softened, but clarity has not yet arrived. The old way no longer fits, and the new way has not taken shape. This is where most people panic. This is also where becoming actually happens. There is a belief that growth is a straight line. You set a goal, you move toward it, and when you arrive, you are transformed. Buddhism sees this as an illusion. Goals may organize action, but they do not reshape identity. Identity changes in the spaces where action stalls, in the waiting, in the uncertainty, in the moments where nothing seems to be happening, and yet everything inside is rearranging itself. These in-between states feel uncomfortable because they remove the familiar markers of progress. You cannot measure them, you cannot explain them easily. You cannot even be sure you are moving forward at all. The mind dislikes this deeply. It wants direction, it wants confirmation, it wants an outcome. But becoming is not driven by outcomes. It is shaped by what happens when outcomes are temporarily unavailable. In Buddhist teaching, There is an understanding that the self is not a solid thing, but a process. A flow of causes and conditions constantly interacting. When life is busy and goal-oriented, this flow is hidden by momentum. You are too occupied becoming someone to notice how you are becoming. The gaps interrupt that momentum. They slow the current enough for change to take root. Waiting periods are not empty. They are unstructured. And unstructured time exposes who you are without the scaffolding of roles, plans, and distractions. When you are no longer chasing the next milestone, you begin to notice your inner habits more clearly. How you react to uncertainty, how you speak to yourself when there is no external validation, how quickly you try to replace not knowing with noise. Confusion is especially misunderstood. It is treated as a flaw, something to fix quickly. But confusion often means that old frameworks have collapsed and new ones have not yet formed. This is not regression, it is transition. When the mind no longer has a clear map, it becomes sensitive, open, vulnerable. This vulnerability is not weakness. It is the state in which learning actually happens. Think about how identity is usually formed, through repetition, through reinforcement, through certainty. You do the same things, think the same thoughts, respond the same way, and over time, a sense of self solidifies. The gaps interrupt this cycle. They remove repetition, they disrupt reinforcement, they loosen certainty. Without these supports, identity becomes fluid again. This fluidity feels disorienting because it removes your sense of position. You may feel like you do not know who you are anymore. Old labels no longer resonate. New ones feel premature. Buddhism does not see this as a crisis. It sees it as maturity. The ability to remain present without clinging to a fixed identity is a sign of deepening awareness. In liminal states, the mind often tries to rush ahead. It searches for meaning. It tries to assign purpose. It asks, what is this for? Buddhism offers a different question. Can you stay? Not stay forever, but stay without forcing resolution. Can you allow the process to unfold without demanding that it explain itself to you? This patience is not passive. It is an active openness. You are not waiting for something to happen. You are allowing yourself to be reshaped by what is already happening. The nervous system recalibrates. Emotional patterns reorganize. Perception shifts subtly. None of this is dramatic. It is quiet work. Many people miss this transformation because they are looking for visible change. A new belief, a new role, a new direction. But identity does not change through declarations. It changes through exposure. Prolonged exposure to uncertainty teaches you that you can survive without certainty. Prolonged exposure to waiting teaches you that worth is not tied to productivity. Prolonged exposure to confusion teaches you that understanding is not always immediate. In Buddhist practice, retreats often include long periods of silence and repetition, not to create insight directly, but to create gaps. Gaps in speech, gaps in stimulation, gaps in narrative. These gaps remove the usual ways you reinforce who you think you are. Without those reinforcements, identity softens. Something more responsive can emerge. The ego resists this process because it thrives on definition. It wants to know where it stands. It wants to be someone. In the gaps, it loses its footing. This can feel like loss. You may grieve the version of yourself that knew what it was doing, that had answers, that felt purposeful. Buddhism allows this grief. It does not rush you past it. Grief is part of becoming. When an old identity dissolves, even if it was limiting, it still represented safety. Letting it go creates a sense of exposure. The mind may try to rebuild quickly, to fill the space with a new story. But if you allow the space to remain open a little longer, something different happens. You stop being defined by the story at all. This does not mean you become passive or directionless. it means direction arises more organically. Instead of forcing a future, you begin to respond to the present with greater sensitivity. Choices feel less driven by fear and more by alignment. This alignment cannot be planned. It emerges from having spent enough time not knowing. Waiting also reveals attachment to outcomes. When you cannot move forward, you see how much of your self-worth was tied to progress. You see how uncomfortable it is to exist without improvement. This discomfort is instructive. It shows you the conditions under which you feel allowed to exist. Buddhism gently questions those conditions. There is a deep freedom in realizing that you do not need to be arriving to be alive. The gaps teach this not intellectually, but experientially. Day after day of not knowing does something to you. It humbles you, it steadies you, it removes the urgency to prove yourself. Confusion, when not resisted, sharpens awareness. You listen more closely, you observe more carefully, you stop assuming. This openness allows new perspectives to enter without being filtered through old expectations. Insight arrives quietly, often long after the confusion itself has passed. This is why becoming cannot be rushed. Identity reshapes itself through repeated contact with uncertainty. Each time you remain present without collapsing into panic or distraction, something inside strengthens. You develop trust. Not in outcomes, but in your capacity to meet experience as it unfolds. The gaps are also where compassion deepens. When you no longer know who you are, it becomes harder to judge others for being lost. You recognize the shared human condition of uncertainty. This recognition softens the boundaries between self and other. Empathy grows naturally, without effort. Goals have their place. They organize behavior. They give structure. But they cannot hold your becoming. They are too narrow. The gaps are wide enough to include contradiction, paradox, and complexity. Identity needs this space to evolve beyond simplistic definitions. In time, you may notice that the need for certainty diminishes, not because you have answers, but because you no longer require them to feel grounded. You can move forward without clarity. You can rest without resolution. This is not resignation. It is stability. Buddhism calls this learning to dwell in not knowing, not as ignorance, but as openness. When you stop insisting on fixed meaning, experience becomes richer, less controlled, more alive. You are no longer trying to become a finished product. You are participating in a process. The gaps teach you how to listen to life instead of commanding it. They teach you timing. They teach you restraint. They teach you humility. These qualities cannot be acquired through achievement. They emerge through waiting. Eventually, something shifts again. Not suddenly, not dramatically. You find yourself responding differently, less reactive, less rushed, more present. You may not be able to explain what changed, but you know you are not the same. This is the quiet work of becoming. It does not announce itself. It does not offer proof. It simply leaves you more available to reality, more flexible, less defended. And when direction returns, as it always does, it comes from a different place. Not from anxiety, but from clarity that has matured in silence. The goals you choose now are not attempts to escape discomfort. They are expressions of understanding shaped in the gaps. This is why the waiting mattered. This is why the confusion was necessary. This is why nothing happening was actually everything happening. You are not behind. You were not lost. You were in the space where identity learns how to breathe. And from here, the becoming continues. As direction slowly returns after time spent in uncertainty, something else often appears alongside it. A quiet pressure, a subtle expectation, the feeling that now, finally, you should be done, that the confusion should be over, that the work should have paid off by now. This pressure is rarely spoken out loud, but it sits underneath many spiritual paths, and without noticing it, it becomes a new source of suffering. There is a deeply rooted belief that growth has an end point. a final version of you that is healed, stable, wise, and no longer troubled by old patterns. This belief feels motivating at first. It gives shape to effort, but over time, it turns against you, because every time discomfort returns, every time doubt reappears, the mind whispers the same message. You should be past this by now. This is the illusion of the finished self, the idea that there is a version of you who will one day arrive and remain unchanged. Buddhism challenges this belief at its core, not by saying healing is impossible, but by showing that completion itself is a misunderstanding of how life works. Impermanence is one of the central teachings of Buddhism, not as a concept to memorize, but as a reality to observe. Everything that arises changes. Sensations change, emotions change, thoughts change, even insight changes. There is nothing in experience that stays fixed, and yet the mind keeps looking for something permanent to become. When you believe you should already be healed, you turn impermanence into a problem. You measure yourself against an imagined finish line. You judge each return of pain as evidence that you failed. This judgment creates suffering that is separate from the original difficulty. The pain may be natural. The judgment is optional. The idea of being finished often hides behind words like growth, progress, and self-mastery. These words are not wrong, but they are easily misunderstood. Growth does not mean elimination of struggle. Progress does not mean immunity from pain. Mastery does not mean control over life. When these words are interpreted as finality, they become weapons turned inward. In Buddhism, awakening is not described as becoming flawless. It is described as seeing clearly. And clear seeing reveals that the self is not a static object moving toward completion. It is a dynamic process responding to changing conditions. Expecting it to be finished is like expecting a river to stop flowing. Self-judgment arises when reality does not match expectation. If you expect healing to be linear, any setback feels like failure. If you expect wisdom to be permanent, confusion feels like regression. But these expectations are not based on how life actually unfolds. They are based on an idealized image of selfhood. The finished self is comforting because it promises rest. It promises an end to effort, an end to vulnerability, an end to uncertainty. But this promise is false, and chasing it creates a constant tension between who you are and who you think you should be. This tension is subtle but exhausting. You may notice it in the way you speak to yourself, the impatience, the disappointment, the quiet comparison to others who seem further along. This is not motivation. It is self-rejection disguised as aspiration. Buddhism does not ask you to lower your standards. It asks you to change the way you relate to becoming. Instead of aiming for a finished identity, it invites you to rest in ongoing responsiveness, to meet each moment as it is, without measuring it against an imagined end state. Impermanence dissolves self-judgment by revealing that there is no fixed self to perfect. What you call you is a collection of habits, perceptions, memories, and reactions arising in this moment. When conditions change, these change. When circumstances shift, so do you. Expecting continuity in a world defined by change is the root of frustration. This does not mean nothing matters. It means nothing stays solved forever. Even insight must be renewed. Even clarity must be practiced. Not because you are deficient, but because life keeps moving. Many people mistake the return of old patterns as proof that healing failed. Buddhism sees this differently. Patterns return because conditions return, stress returns, loss returns, uncertainty returns. And with them, familiar responses may arise. The difference is not whether they arise, but how you meet them. When you stop expecting to be finished, you stop being surprised by difficulty. You meet it with curiosity instead of shame. You ask what is present now, not why it should not be present. The belief in a finished self also creates separation. You begin to divide yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. The healed part is welcomed. The struggling part is pushed away. This division fragments the self and creates inner conflict. Buddhism emphasizes integration. Nothing is excluded. Everything is included in awareness. This inclusion is not indulgence, it is honesty. When you allow all states to arise without labeling them as regression, you create a stable ground for genuine change. Change that is not driven by fear of being unfinished, but by understanding of what is happening. There is a quiet grief that often accompanies the release of the finished self. You may realize that the moment you were waiting for will never arrive in the way you imagined. There will not be a final state where effort ends and peace remains forever. This realization can feel disappointing, but it is also liberating. Without the pressure to arrive, you are free to engage with life as it is. You stop postponing acceptance. You stop withholding compassion until you are better. You allow yourself to be human now, not later. Impermanence also dissolves comparison. When you understand that everyone is in flux, the idea of being ahead or behind loses meaning. There is no universal timeline, no shared endpoint. Each person responds to conditions differently. Measuring yourself against others becomes unnecessary. Self-judgment often comes from treating inner states as personal achievements or failures. Buddhism reframes them as conditions. When certain causes are present, certain effects arise. This is not a moral evaluation. It is a description of reality. When sadness arises, it is not because you are unhealed. It is because conditions support sadness. When clarity arises, it is not because you have arrived. It is because conditions support clarity. Both are temporary, both are valid. This understanding softens the harsh inner voice that demands consistency. You no longer expect yourself to maintain a particular state. You allow fluctuation. You allow rhythm. You begin to trust that change does not erase progress. It expresses it. The finished self is also tied to control. If you believe there is a final version of you, you may believe it can be maintained through effort. This creates anxiety. You become vigilant, afraid of slipping back, afraid of losing ground. Buddhism offers a different stability. Not control over states, but trust in awareness. Awareness does not need to be finished. It simply needs to be present. When you rest in awareness, changing states do not threaten you. They pass through. You remain. Letting go of the finished self does not mean abandoning growth. It means releasing the fantasy that growth leads to permanence. Growth leads to flexibility, to responsiveness, to a deeper capacity to meet life without rigid expectations. This shift changes how you relate to healing practices. They become supports, not requirements, tools, not obligations. You engage with them because they help, not because you must fix yourself. Over time, the question changes. Not, why am I not healed yet, but what is being asked of me now? This question is grounded. It does not assume failure, it assumes presence. Impermanence also brings kindness. When you see that nothing stays resolved forever, you stop blaming yourself for needing care again. You recognize care as ongoing, not corrective, something you offer yourself repeatedly, not something you graduate from. The illusion of the finished self fades gradually. It loosens its hold as you experience life without constantly evaluating your status. You stop waiting to become worthy of peace. You stop delaying acceptance. What remains is a simpler relationship with yourself, one that allows change without drama, one that meets difficulty without judgment, one that understands that becoming has no final form. You do not need to be complete to be whole. You do not need to be healed to be worthy of compassion. You do not need to arrive to belong to your own life. Impermanence does not take anything away from you. It frees you from the burden of being done. And in that freedom, something unexpected happens. you become lighter. Not because problems disappear, but because you stop carrying the belief that they should not exist. This is not resignation, it is realism infused with kindness. It is seeing life clearly without demanding that it settle into a shape it cannot hold. You are not unfinished, you are not behind, you are not failing, you are living a process that does not end. And when this truth is allowed to settle, the inner critic loses its authority. Not because it is silenced, but because it is no longer believed. The path continues, not toward a final self, but toward a deeper ease with change itself. And from here, the becoming takes on a different tone, less urgency, less judgment, more trust. You are not broken. You are not meant to be finished. You are becoming. As the pressure to be finished begins to dissolve, another heavy weight often comes into view. It is quieter, older, and more deeply rooted. It is the feeling that your past defines you, that what you have done, failed to do, or become stuck in has marked you permanently. Even when you release the idea of a final self, this sense of moral burden can linger, and at the center of it is a single word that has been deeply misunderstood: karma. For many people, karma feels like a sentence, a cosmic scorecard, a system of reward and punishment that keeps track of your mistakes and ensures you pay for them later. This belief creates fear. It creates shame. It creates the sense that suffering is something you deserve. Buddhism does not teach this. But over time, this distortion has become widespread, and it quietly shapes how people relate to themselves. The original meaning of karma is far simpler and far more humane. Karma means action, not judgment, not destiny, not punishment. Action, and the momentum that follows from it. Every action leaves a trace, not because the universe is moralistic, but because patterns repeat when they are reinforced. Karma is not about what you deserve, it is about what you are moving toward. When this is understood, something profound changes. Shame begins to loosen its grip. The story that you are paying for who you were starts to fall apart. Suffering is no longer interpreted as a verdict. It becomes a signal of direction. In Buddhist thought, karma operates like habit. When you repeat certain actions, ways of thinking, or emotional responses, they gain strength. They become easier to repeat. This creates a sense of inevitability, but it is not fate, it is momentum. And momentum can change. Shame arises when karma is misunderstood as moral debt. You believe that because you made mistakes, you are now stained, that life is responding to you with judgment. This belief traps you in a fixed identity. You see yourself as someone who is paying for the past rather than someone who is capable of redirecting the present. Buddhism removes this burden by removing blame from the equation. Karma does not care who you are. It responds to what is repeated. If certain conditions are present, certain results follow. This is not personal, it is mechanical. This understanding is deeply relieving. It means that suffering is not a punishment inflicted on you. It is the natural result of conditions that can be seen, understood, and gradually changed. Nothing is held against you. Nothing is recorded as debt. When you feel stuck in old patterns, it is not because you are being punished. It is because momentum takes time to slow down. A river does not stop flowing the moment you decide to change direction. But with consistent redirection, its course can shift. This view transforms responsibility. Responsibility no longer means carrying guilt. It means recognizing influence. You are not blamed for the past, but you are empowered in the present. What you do now matters not because it erases the past, but because it shapes what comes next. Karma also explains why insight alone does not immediately change behavior. You may understand something deeply and still find yourself repeating old habits. This is not hypocrisy, it is momentum. Understanding introduces a new force into the system, but it must be applied repeatedly to counteract what has been reinforced over time. When karma is seen as momentum, patience becomes essential. You stop expecting instant transformation. You stop shaming yourself for slow progress. You understand that change is cumulative, not dramatic. This perspective also dissolves the idea of being doomed by early life experiences. Trauma, conditioning, and environment create strong karmic patterns. They influence how you perceive, react, and cope. Buddhism does not deny this. It acknowledges it fully, but it also insists that these patterns are not permanent identities. They are conditioned responses, and what is conditioned can be reconditioned. Shame thrives on the belief that you are your past actions. Karma, rightly understood, shows that you are shaped by actions, but not defined by them. You are the field in which actions arise, not the actions themselves. This distinction matters. When you identify with past mistakes, you freeze them into identity. When you see them as momentum, you can work with them. You stop asking, "What is wrong with me?" and start asking, "What has been reinforced?" This shift removes moral drama from growth. You are no longer trying to become a better person in an abstract sense. You are adjusting patterns. You are changing direction. This is practical, grounded, humane. Karma also operates internally. Thoughts create momentum. Emotional reactions create momentum. The way you speak to yourself creates momentum. If you repeatedly respond to difficulty with self-attack, that response strengthens. It becomes automatic. This is karmic momentum. Not because you deserve to suffer, but because repetition shapes response. When you understand this, self-compassion becomes strategic, not sentimental. Treating yourself with kindness is not a reward for being good. It is a way of interrupting harmful momentum. It introduces a new pattern into the system. This is why Buddhism emphasizes mindfulness, not as a moral practice, but as a way of seeing momentum in real time. When you notice a reaction as it arises, you create a pause. In that pause, momentum weakens. Choice becomes possible. The pause does not erase the pattern, it slows it. Over time, these pauses accumulate. A different direction begins to form. This is karma in motion. Seeing karma this way also changes how you relate to others. Instead of judging people as good or bad, you begin to see patterns and conditions. You recognize that harmful behavior often comes from entrenched momentum, not inherent flaw. This does not excuse harm, but it removes dehumanization. Compassion grows naturally from this understanding, not because you deny responsibility, but because you see how difficult it is to change direction once momentum is strong. You recognize effort where before you saw failure. This understanding also frees you from spiritual guilt. Many people believe they are failing spiritually because old tendencies persist. They assume practice should purify them completely. Karma as momentum explains why this expectation is unrealistic. Practice introduces new forces, but it does not erase conditioning overnight. Progress becomes less about purity and more about trajectory. Are you moving even slowly toward less suffering? Are reactions softening? Is awareness increasing? These questions replace moral judgment. There is also relief in realizing that not all suffering is personal karma. Buddhism acknowledges collective and situational conditions, social structures, economic realities, health, loss. Not everything that happens to you is the result of your past actions. This understanding prevents self-blame from expanding beyond reason. Shame thrives in vagueness. Karma, clarified, becomes specific. It points to particular patterns, not global condemnation. You can work with specific patterns. You cannot work with the belief that you are fundamentally flawed. This clarity brings dignity back to the path. You are no longer crawling toward redemption. You are learning how to steer. Karma as momentum also explains why small actions matter. A single moment of awareness may not change everything, but it contributes. A single choice toward kindness may feel insignificant, but it alters direction. Over time, these small shifts accumulate into real change. This accumulation is quiet. It does not announce itself. You may not feel different day to day, but one day you respond differently without effort. That is karma changing course. Understanding karma this way also softens regret. Regret becomes information, not self-punishment. You see where momentum was created and where it can be redirected. You learn without condemning yourself. The past does not vanish, but it loses its power to define you. It becomes part of the landscape, not the destination. This reinterpretation of karma also restores trust in yourself. You stop fearing that one mistake will doom you. You understand that no single action defines direction, patterns do, and patterns can be changed. Freedom from shame does not mean freedom from responsibility. It means responsibility without cruelty. You take ownership of your influence without turning it into identity. This is deeply healing. Many people carry invisible shame for years, believing their suffering is deserved. Karma as momentum dismantles this belief gently but thoroughly. Nothing is being held against you. There is no cosmic ledger. There is only movement, and movement can change. When this understanding settles, the inner landscape becomes lighter. You stop carrying the weight of moral debt. You stop interpreting pain as judgment. You engage with life more openly, more honestly. The path forward becomes clearer, not because it is easy, but because it is no longer blocked by shame. You are not paying for who you were. You are shaping who you are becoming. And from this place, something else becomes possible. Not just change, but compassion for the parts of you that learned to survive the only way they knew how. Karma does not ask you to suffer for the past. It invites you to participate in the present. And as you do, the direction continues to shift. You are not condemned by your history. You are carried forward by what you practice now. You are not broken. You are becoming. As shame loosens and the past no longer feels like a sentence, something else quietly collapses. Not all at once, not dramatically, but deeply. The structures you once relied on to feel separate, protected, and in control begin to give way. This moment is often misunderstood as failure. In Buddhist understanding, it is something very different. It is the ground from which true compassion grows. There is a widespread belief that compassion comes from being strong, healed, and emotionally stable, that once you have your life together, kindness will naturally overflow. Buddhism offers a more uncomfortable truth. The kind of compassion that embraces all beings does not usually arise from wholeness. It arises from fracture, from the moment you can no longer hold yourself above suffering. Breakdown strips away distance. Before it happens, pain often feels personal, yours versus theirs, my story versus your story. But when life breaks you open, suffering loses its boundaries. You stop seeing it as an individual flaw and begin to recognize it as a shared condition. This recognition is not intellectual, it is visceral. Bodhicitta, the wish for awakening for the benefit of all beings, is not born from moral intention alone. It is born from contact, from being touched by suffering so deeply that separation becomes impossible to maintain. Before breakdown, compassion is often selective. After breakdown, it becomes inclusive. Personal collapse removes the illusion that you are different. Different in strength, different in luck, different in control. You see clearly that the same forces that brought you to your knees are moving through everyone else as well. Fear, loss, confusion, desire, aging, death. This does not make you bitter, it makes you tender. In Buddhist teaching, the heart opens not because you decide it should, but because it can no longer remain closed. Defenses exhaust themselves, strategies fail, control slips, and in that vulnerability, something unexpected enters, a quiet solidarity with life as it is. Before breakdown, compassion often carries conditions. You feel for those who deserve it, those who try hard enough, those who behave well. After breakdown, these conditions fall away. You no longer ask whether suffering is justified. You recognize it instantly. You respond without calculation. This is why many spiritual traditions speak of humility as the doorway to wisdom. Not humility as self-deprecation, but humility as accurate perception. You no longer overestimate your separateness. You no longer underestimate your shared fragility. Breakdown also dissolves judgment. When your own life falls apart, simplistic explanations stop working. You can no longer tell yourself that suffering happens only to those who make poor choices. You see how complex causation really is, how many forces shape a single moment. This understanding softens your view of others. Compassion deepens because you stop expecting people to be other than they are. You recognize how much effort it takes just to function. You recognize how little room there often is for grace. This recognition changes how you move through the world. Bodhicitta is not pity. It is not feeling sorry for others from a position of safety. It is the resolve to stay present with suffering without turning away. This resolve is forged in breakdown. You learn that turning away does not actually protect you. It isolates you. When your own defenses fail, you learn what it means to need support, to be seen, to be met without judgment. This experience rewires empathy. You no longer offer advice first. You offer presence. You know how much that matters. Breakdown also reveals the limits of self-centered awakening. You may have sought peace for yourself, clarity for yourself, relief for yourself. But when collapse arrives, you see that isolation cannot be healed in isolation. You realize that freedom is relational. It arises in connection, not escape. This realization marks a turning point. The path shifts from self-improvement to shared liberation. Not because you become selfless, but because the self you were trying to protect no longer feels solid. Buddhism does not romanticize suffering. Breakdown is painful, disorienting, often frightening, but it acknowledges its transformative potential. When the heart is broken open, it becomes more permeable, more responsive, less defended. This permeability allows compassion to move through you rather than being something you perform. You are no longer trying to be kind. You simply feel the impact of suffering more directly. Response arises naturally. There is also grief in this process. You may grieve the loss of innocence, the belief that life could be controlled, the belief that goodness guarantees safety. This grief is part of compassion. It is the mourning of illusions that kept you separate. As these illusions fall away, you begin to see suffering not as interruption, but as a common ground. Something that connects rather than isolates. This does not make pain desirable. It makes it intelligible. Bodhicitta also carries courage. After breakdown, you know how much suffering hurts. And yet, instead of closing down, you choose to stay engaged. You choose to care anyway. This choice is not heroic. It is honest. You know that turning away will not spare you, so you turn toward. This turning toward does not require fixing others. It requires witnessing, accompanying, allowing. You stop trying to rescue and start trying to understand. This shift prevents burnout. It grounds compassion in realism. Breakdown teaches you limits. You learn that you cannot carry everything. You cannot save everyone. This knowledge refines compassion. It becomes sustainable. It respects boundaries without withdrawing care. Bodhicitta is often misunderstood as constant self-sacrifice. In reality, it arises from clarity about interdependence. You care for others because you are part of the same fabric, not because you erase yourself. When breakdown strips away false independence, interdependence becomes obvious. You see how much you rely on others, how much others rely on you. Compassion becomes less about choice and more about alignment with reality. This alignment also changes how you treat yourself. Self-compassion deepens because you recognize yourself as one being among many, subject to the same forces. You stop demanding perfection. You stop withholding kindness until improvement. The compassion that arises after breakdown is quieter than idealized kindness. It does not announce itself. It shows up in patience, in listening, in restraint, in the willingness to stay present when things are uncomfortable. It also shows up in forgiveness, not because harm is minimized, but because understanding has deepened. You see how pain travels, how it passes from one person to another. Forgiveness becomes a way of interrupting that transmission. This does not mean you accept harm. It means you respond without hatred. You protect without dehumanizing. This balance is difficult. It is learned through lived experience, not theory. Bodhisattva also changes your relationship to spiritual practice. Practice is no longer about personal serenity alone. It becomes an offering, a way of cultivating clarity and stability so you can be more available to others. This availability does not require constant engagement. It requires readiness. The readiness to respond with care when contact occurs. The readiness to remain human in the presence of pain. Breakdown often reveals the limits of self-focus. When your own suffering becomes overwhelming, the idea of endless self-analysis loses appeal. You realize that healing also happens through contribution, through connection, through shared meaning. This does not mean bypassing your pain. It means recognizing that your pain connects you to others rather than separating you. This connection is the seed of bodhisattva. Over time, compassion becomes less emotional and more embodied. You do not feel overwhelmed by every story. You feel grounded, present, able to remain without collapsing or distancing. This balance comes from having collapsed before. You know what it is like to fall apart. You know what it takes to reassemble slowly. This knowledge informs your care. Bodhisattva is not a peak state. It is a direction, a commitment to orient your life toward reducing suffering, starting with how you meet what is in front of you. This orientation often arises quietly. One day you notice you are less interested in proving yourself, less interested in winning arguments, more interested in understanding. This shift is the fruit of breakdown. You are no longer trying to be above life. You are willing to be with it. This willingness changes everything. It changes how you speak, how you listen, how you judge, how you forgive, how you act. Compassion born from collapse is not naive. It knows darkness. It knows limits. It knows failure. And because of that, it is steady. This steadiness is the heart of bodhisattva, not a feeling, but a resolve. The resolve to stay engaged with suffering without turning it into an enemy. You did not arrive here because you were virtuous. You arrived because you were broken open by life, and in that opening, something larger than your personal story began to move. You stopped asking only how to be free. You began to ask how freedom might include everyone. This is not the end of the path, it is a widening of it. The becoming continues, but it no longer revolves around you alone. And from this widening, a different kind of strength emerges. Quiet, durable, compassionate, born not from success, but from having nothing left to protect. You are not broken. You were broken open, and through that opening, the heart learned how to care. As compassion widens and the heart opens beyond the boundaries of the personal story, a new tension quietly enters. It does not announce itself as cruelty. It disguises itself as discipline, growth, and responsibility. It sounds reasonable, even noble, and yet beneath it, something tightens again. The urge to improve turns into the urge to erase. This is where another misunderstanding takes root. There is a moment on the path when you sincerely want to live with less harm, more clarity, more care. This intention is genuine, but slowly, almost invisibly, it can shift into something harsher. The feeling that who you are right now is not enough, that the present version of you is a problem that must be corrected. Buddhism treats this shift with great care, because it recognizes how easily self-improvement turns into self-rejection. The hidden violence of self-improvement lies in its starting point, not in the actions themselves, but in the belief beneath them. When growth begins from curiosity and care, it nourishes life. When it begins from dissatisfaction with your existence, it becomes an attack disguised as progress. Violence here does not mean aggression in the obvious sense. It means refusal. The refusal to allow yourself to exist as you are. The refusal to offer dignity to your current state. The belief that you must become something else before you are allowed kindness, rest, or belonging. This belief is deeply normalized. You are taught from an early age that value is conditional, that you must earn worth through achievement, improvement, or correction. Spiritual paths are not immune to this conditioning. They often absorb it and reframe it with gentler language, but the structure remains the same. When you approach practice as a way to fix yourself, every moment becomes a test. Every emotion becomes evidence. If anger appears, you have failed. If fear arises, you are not advanced enough. If sadness lingers, something must be wrong. This creates a constant undercurrent of self-surveillance. Buddhism does not ask you to eliminate parts of yourself, it asks you to understand them. Understanding cannot happen in an atmosphere of hostility. When you are at war with your own experience, awareness narrows. You see only what you want to remove, not what is actually present. Self-improvement often carries a subtle timeline, an unspoken expectation that by now you should be calmer, wiser, more compassionate. When this expectation is not met, frustration arises. You try harder, you push more. The path becomes strained. This strain is a signal, not that you are failing, but that your relationship to growth has become distorted. You are no longer listening, you are forcing. Forcing creates resistance. Parts of you begin to hide. Emotions go underground. Behavior becomes performative. You may appear composed while something inside is tightening. This is not peace, it is control. The Buddha's teaching begins with an honest acknowledgement of suffering, not as something to fix immediately, but as something to be known. Knowing suffering requires allowing it to exist. The moment you try to remove it prematurely, you miss its message. Self-improvement culture often treats discomfort as an obstacle. Buddhism treats it as a teacher. When you try to improve yourself out of discomfort, you silence that teacher. You skip the lesson in favor of a solution. This is where violence enters. Not because effort is wrong, but because listening has been replaced by correction. You are no longer asking what this moment needs. You are telling it what it should be. There is also exhaustion in this approach. Constant self-monitoring drains energy. You are never fully at rest because rest feels undeserved. You are always preparing for the next version of yourself. The present becomes a waiting room you rush through. Buddhism invites a radical shift. Growth begins with acceptance, not as approval of harm, but as recognition of reality. You cannot transform what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot soften what you are attacking. Acceptance does not mean staying the same. It means starting from where you are without hostility. From this ground, change becomes possible without violence. The difference between violent and non-violent growth is subtle but profound. Violent growth says, I must change to be worthy. Non-violent growth says, I change because I am alive. One rejects the present, the other includes it. Self-improvement often uses comparison as fuel. You look at others who seem more advanced, more peaceful, more consistent. This comparison reinforces the belief that you are lacking. Buddhism encourages you to look inward instead, not to judge, but to understand conditions. When you understand conditions, blame dissolves. You see why certain habits formed. You see how responses developed. This understanding generates patience. Patience allows change to unfold at a pace the nervous system can tolerate. Violence arises when the nervous system is pushed beyond its capacity. You may force yourself to meditate longer than feels safe. You may suppress emotions to appear equanimous. You may shame yourself for needing rest. These actions may look disciplined, but they disconnect you from your body. Buddhist practice is not meant to override the body, it is meant to include it. The body is where experience happens. Ignoring it creates fragmentation. Another form of hidden violence is spiritual bypassing, using ideas of transcendence to avoid ordinary pain, telling yourself you should be above grief, beyond anger, untouched by fear. This bypassing invalidates lived experience. It sends the message that being human is a problem. But the Buddha did not transcend humanity, he understood it. He sat with hunger, with discomfort, with doubt. Awakening did not remove these experiences, it changed the relationship to them. When you try to fix yourself, you often skip relationship. You jump straight to outcome. Buddhism slows this down. It teaches you to stay with what arises long enough to learn from it. Learning requires humility, not the humility of self-criticism, but the humility of curiosity. You admit you do not fully understand your own experience yet. You allow it to unfold without forcing a conclusion. This humility dismantles the inner hierarchy that ranks parts of you as higher or lower, more spiritual or less spiritual, acceptable or unacceptable. Buddhism sees all experiences as arising from conditions. None are inherently superior. When you remove hierarchy, compassion becomes easier. You stop policing your inner world. You stop punishing yourself for being human. Self-improvement often promises control. If you do the right practices, follow the right steps, you will manage your mind perfectly. Buddhism is honest about the limits of control. Thoughts arise, emotions shift, life interrupts. Practice is not about domination, it is about relationship. A relational approach to growth asks different questions. Instead of, how do I stop this? You ask, what is this showing me? Instead of, how do I become better? You ask, how can I be more present? Presence is not passive, it is engaged. It requires courage to stay with discomfort without trying to fix it. This courage is quieter than ambition, but far more transformative. When you stop treating yourself as a problem, a surprising thing happens. Energy returns, curiosity returns, growth becomes less forced and more organic. You still change, but the change feels integrated rather than imposed. This does not mean you abandon intention. It means intention is guided by care rather than self-disgust. You practice because it supports life, not because you are defective. The violence of self-improvement often shows up in language. The way you speak to yourself, harsh, demanding, unforgiving. Buddhism pays close attention to speech, including inner speech. Words shape experience. Repeated self-attack creates internal conditions of fear and contraction. When language softens, the system relaxes. From relaxation, learning deepens. This is not indulgence, it is efficiency. A relaxed system integrates insight more effectively than a tense one. Another hidden cost of self-improvement is alienation from others. When you see yourself as a project, you begin to see others the same way. You evaluate, diagnose, judge. Compassion becomes conditional. Letting go of the need to fix yourself restores equality. You meet others as fellow processors, not problems to solve. This restores genuine connection. Buddhism emphasizes non-harming. This includes not harming yourself through unrealistic expectations. Non-harming is not only about actions, but about attitudes. How you hold yourself matters. Growth without violence respects timing. It understands that some changes take years. Some patterns dissolve slowly. This patience is not laziness, it is attunement. When you align with your actual capacity, progress becomes sustainable. You do not burn out. You do not oscillate between intensity and collapse. You move steadily. The paradox is that when you stop trying to fix yourself, you often change more deeply, because resistance drops, because awareness increases, because compassion replaces pressure. This does not mean discomfort disappears. It means you stop treating discomfort as evidence that you are wrong. You allow it to inform rather than condemn. The hidden violence of self-improvement dissolves when you recognize that your humanity is not an obstacle to awakening. It is the ground of it. You do not need to become someone else to be free. You need to meet who you are without hostility. This meeting is the beginning of true transformation. From here, the path continues with less force and more trust, less striving and more listening. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a life unfolding, and when growth arises from care rather than rejection, it no longer wounds on the way forward. You are not broken, you are becoming. As the urge to fix yourself softens, something else becomes impossible to ignore. The patterns that keep returning, the emotions you thought you had outgrown, the same reactions resurfacing at different moments, wearing new faces but carrying familiar weight. Without the pressure to eliminate them, a new question quietly arises. What if they are not here to defeat you, but to teach you? Recurring emotions are often treated as enemies on the inner path. Anger that keeps coming back, fear that reappears when you least expect it, sadness that lingers even after insight. These experiences are usually met with frustration or shame. You tell yourself you should be beyond this. That awareness should have cured it by now. Buddhism invites a different relationship, one that replaces opposition with curiosity. An emotion that returns is not a failure of progress. It is a message that has not yet been fully heard. Emotional patterns are not random. They are shaped by conditions, history, and unmet needs. When they repeat, it is because something remains unresolved. Not because you are weak, but because learning unfolds in layers. In Buddhist psychology, emotions are not treated as personal defects. They are treated as conditioned responses. They arise when certain triggers meet certain vulnerabilities. When you understand this, blame dissolves. You stop asking what is wrong with you and start asking what is being activated. This shift is subtle but transformative. Instead of trying to suppress or override emotions, you begin to listen to them, not to obey them blindly, but to understand their function. Every recurring emotion has a role. It protects, it warns, it remembers, it signals. Fear often points to perceived threat, not always a real one, but a remembered one. Anger often arises when a boundary feels violated or unheard. Sadness often marks loss, even when the loss is old or unacknowledged. These emotions persist not because they enjoy tormenting you, but because their message has not yet been integrated. When emotions are treated as enemies, they intensify. Resistance adds fuel. The body tightens, the mind argues, the emotion grows louder. This creates the illusion that emotions are overpowering. In reality, they are responding to being ignored or attacked. Buddhist practice emphasizes mindful observation. When an emotion arises, you notice it without immediately acting on it or pushing it away. This creates space. In that space, the emotion begins to reveal its structure. You notice where it lives in the body, how it shifts, what thoughts accompany it. This observation turns reaction into learning. Emotional patterns often originate early. They form as adaptive responses to environments where certain needs were unmet. These responses were intelligent at the time. They helped you survive. As circumstances change, the responses may become outdated, but they do not disappear simply because they are no longer needed. They persist until acknowledged. Treating these patterns as enemies adds insult to injury. You judge yourself for responses that once protected you. Buddhism encourages gratitude for these adaptations, even as you gently update them. You honor their role without letting them run your life. Recurring emotions also reveal attachment. They show where expectations clash with reality, where desires are unmet, where identity feels threatened. Instead of viewing this as weakness, you can see it as information. Where you care deeply, emotion will arise. This is not a flaw, it is a sign of engagement. Many people believe that spiritual maturity means emotional neutrality, that being awakened means being unbothered. Buddhism does not support this idea. Awakening does not remove emotion. It removes confusion about emotion. You still feel, but you no longer drown. When an emotion repeats, it often carries layers. The surface feeling may be anger, but beneath it may be grief. Beneath grief may be fear. Beneath fear may be longing. These layers unfold only when you stay present. If you rush to fix the surface, the deeper lesson remains hidden. This is why emotional patterns repeat, not because they enjoy repetition, but because they are layered. Each encounter offers an opportunity to go deeper, to notice something new, to respond differently. This deepening is gradual. It cannot be forced. Buddhism teaches that insight alone does not dissolve conditioning. Insight must be embodied. Emotions live in the body. They are not resolved by understanding alone. They are resolved through repeated experiences of safety, presence, and non-reactivity. When you meet an emotion with steadiness instead of resistance, the nervous system learns. It learns that the emotion is survivable, that it does not require immediate action. Over time, this learning reduces intensity. The emotion may still arise, but it passes more quickly. This process requires patience. Emotional patterns often took years to form. Expecting them to dissolve instantly is unrealistic. Patience here is not passive waiting. It is active presence. Each encounter is a practice. Shame often arises around recurring emotions. You tell yourself you should know better. Buddhism dismantles this shame by removing the moral overlay. Emotions are not moral failures. They are signals shaped by conditions. When shame is removed, curiosity becomes possible. You can ask gentle questions. What does this emotion want? What does it fear? What does it protect? These questions open dialogue rather than conflict. Emotional patterns also reveal values. You feel pain where something matters. Anger often arises where care is present. Sadness arises where attachment exists. Fear arises where safety is desired. These emotions point to what you value. Understanding this helps you align your life more honestly. Suppressing emotions often leads to rigidity. You become disconnected from your inner life. This disconnection reduces sensitivity, not freedom. Buddhism values sensitivity. It sees awareness as a living responsiveness, not a numb state. When emotions are welcomed as teachers, they soften, not immediately, but reliably. They no longer need to shout to be heard. They trust that you will listen. This trust changes the relationship. Recurring emotions also teach humility. They remind you that growth is ongoing, that awareness must be renewed, that there is no final mastery over the inner world. This humility prevents arrogance. It keeps the heart open. Emotions are also impermanent. Even the most intense feelings change when observed without interference. This impermanence becomes visible through practice. You see emotions arise, peak, and fade. This observation builds confidence. You trust the process. This trust reduces fear of emotion. You no longer panic when something difficult arises. You know it will move. You know you can stay. Emotional patterns often carry collective material, family dynamics, cultural expectations, historical trauma. Not everything you feel originated with you. Buddhism recognizes interdependence. Emotions move through systems, not isolated individuals. Understanding this reduces self-blame. You see yourself as part of a larger flow. You respond with compassion rather than condemnation. Working with emotional patterns also requires discernment. Not every emotion requires expression. Not every impulse requires action. Awareness allows you to choose. You can feel anger without acting destructively. You can feel fear without withdrawing completely. This choice is freedom. Not freedom from emotion, but freedom within emotion. As you continue this work, emotional patterns become less personal. You recognize familiar states without identifying with them. You say, anger is here, rather than I am angry. This subtle shift creates space. Space allows response. Response replaces reaction. This is the heart of practice. Recurring emotions also teach forgiveness. You forgive yourself for being human. You forgive others for triggering old wounds, not because harm is acceptable, but because understanding has grown. This forgiveness is not forced. It arises naturally when you see how patterns operate, when you see how easily anyone could respond the same way under similar conditions. Emotions also teach limits. They show you when something is too much, when boundaries are needed, when rest is required. Ignoring these messages leads to burnout. Listening leads to balance. Over time, the narrative changes. Instead of saying, "Why does this keep happening?" you say, "What is this showing me now?" This question keeps the path alive. Emotional patterns stop feeling like obstacles. They become part of the curriculum. Each one offers a different lesson. Some about attachment, some about fear, some about love. This learning is not linear. You may revisit the same emotion many times. Each time, understanding deepens. Each time, reaction softens. This is progress, even if it does not feel dramatic. The mind often wants closure, a final resolution. Emotional life rarely offers this. Instead, it offers relationship, an ongoing conversation. Buddhism teaches you how to stay in that conversation without exhaustion. You listen, you respond, you rest, you repeat. As this relationship matures, emotions lose their power to define you. They become experiences rather than identities. You are no longer the angry one, the fearful one, the sad one. You are the one who experiences anger, fear, sadness. This distinction is freeing. It allows movement. It allows change. The greatest lesson emotional patterns offer is compassion, not just toward others, but toward yourself. You learn how to stay present with difficulty without turning away. This capacity changes everything. It changes how you relate to pain, to others, to yourself. Emotions no longer threaten your path. They illuminate it. You stop trying to conquer your inner world. You start learning from it. And in that learning, something settles. Not because emotions disappear, but because you are no longer fighting them. You recognize that nothing inside you is here by accident. Every emotion has been trying to help. When you finally listen, they can rest. You are not weak for feeling. You are wise for learning. You are not broken. You are becoming. As emotions stop being treated like enemies and start being listened to, another belief quietly loosens its grip. The belief that there is something inside you that must be destroyed for you to be free. Many people carry this idea without realizing it. The idea that the ego is the problem, that one day it should disappear, and if it hasn't, you must be doing something wrong. This belief creates a subtle fear, a fear of yourself, a fear that something essential about you is an obstacle to awakening. Buddhism does not teach this, but it is often misunderstood this way, and that misunderstanding creates unnecessary struggle. The ego does not die on the Buddhist path. It softens. The ego, in simple terms, is the organizing principle of experience. It is how sensations, thoughts, memories, and roles are grouped into a sense of me. Without it, you could not function. You could not speak, plan, remember, or care. Buddhism never aimed to remove this capacity. It aimed to free it from rigidity. The problem is not that there is a self. The problem is that the self is treated as solid, permanent, and separate. When the ego hardens, it defends itself constantly. It resists change. It takes everything personally. It interprets experience as threat or validation. This rigidity is what creates suffering. Many people hear teachings about no self and assume they should feel empty or erased. This misunderstanding leads to dissociation, suppression, or spiritual bypassing. Buddhism does not encourage disappearance. It encourages transparency. The self becomes less opaque, less defended, more responsive. When the ego softens, it does not vanish. It becomes flexible. It can hold multiple perspectives without collapsing. It can adapt without losing coherence. This is maturity, not annihilation. Ego death is often imagined as a dramatic event, a sudden loss of identity. But on the Buddhist path, change is usually gradual. You notice that reactions take less time to settle, that criticism stings less, that praise matters less, that roles feel lighter. This is not because the ego is gone, but because it is no longer gripping as tightly. Softening happens through contact, not force. Each time you stay present with discomfort, the ego learns it does not need to defend itself so aggressively. Each time you allow emotion without identification, the ego loosens. Each time you listen instead of reacting, rigidity dissolves a little. The ego's primary job is protection. It formed to keep you safe, to help you navigate a complex world. When it is attacked or shamed, it tightens. When it is understood, it relaxes. Buddhism works with this mechanism gently. Trying to destroy the ego is itself an egoic act. It is driven by aversion, by the desire to eliminate what is perceived as bad. This creates internal conflict. Parts of you fight other parts. This fragmentation increases suffering rather than reducing it. Buddhism teaches non-harming. This includes not harming the sense of self. The practice is to see through the illusion of permanence without rejecting the function of selfhood. When you see that the self is constructed moment by moment, it loses its authority. It is no longer the center of the universe, but it still operates. It just does not dominate. Softening the ego means it becomes permeable. Experience can pass through without sticking. Feedback can be received without defensiveness. Change can occur without panic. This permeability allows responsiveness. You meet situations as they are, rather than through a fixed identity. Responsiveness is different from reactivity. Reactivity is automatic, driven by habit. Responsiveness includes awareness. It allows choice. This is what Buddhist practice cultivates. As emotional patterns are understood rather than fought, the ego stops interpreting them as threats. It no longer needs to suppress or dramatize. It becomes a container rather than a battleground. The softened ego also allows humility, not the humility of feeling small, but the humility of recognizing interdependence. You see how much of who you are depends on conditions. This reduces arrogance and shame simultaneously. You stop taking credit for everything that goes well and stop blaming yourself for everything that goes wrong. This humility opens the heart. Compassion flows more easily when you are not constantly defending a self-image. You are less invested in being right, more interested in understanding. The ego also softens through impermanence. When you repeatedly observe thoughts, emotions, and roles arising and passing, identification weakens. You still use the word I, but it feels lighter, less absolute. You recognize it as a useful label, not a final truth. This recognition does not make life meaningless, it makes it more fluid. You can participate fully without clinging. You can care deeply without ownership. The softened ego also allows vulnerability. When you no longer believe your worth depends on maintaining a particular image, you can admit uncertainty. You can say, I don't know. You can change your mind. This flexibility strengthens relationships. Many people fear that without a strong ego, they will become passive or ineffective. Buddhism does not support passivity. A permeable self can act decisively. The difference is that action is less driven by fear and more by clarity. A rigid ego needs constant validation. A softened ego does not. It can rest. It does not collapse when ignored. It does not inflate when praised. This steadiness is not indifference. It is balance. Softening also changes how boundaries work. A rigid ego builds walls. A softened ego uses discernment. You can say no without hostility. You can protect yourself without dehumanizing others. This discernment is crucial. Softening does not mean losing yourself. It means knowing yourself well enough to respond appropriately. You are less reactive, not less alive. The ego also softens through compassion. When you recognize suffering as shared, self-centeredness naturally decreases. Not because you suppress it, but because it feels less convincing. Your story is no longer the only one that matters. Bodhicitta, the wish for liberation for all beings, cannot coexist with a rigid ego. It requires permeability. It requires the ability to be touched by others' pain without collapsing or closing. This is not self-erasure, it is expansion of concern. The softened ego is capable of intimacy. It listens without preparing defense. It shares without seeking control. It allows closeness without losing autonomy. In meditation, moments of selflessness may arise, a sense of openness without reference point. These moments are not meant to be clung to. They show what is possible when the ego relaxes. They are glimpses, not goals. Clinging to selflessness becomes another identity. Buddhism warns against this. The aim is not to replace one rigid self with another. It is to remain flexible. As practice continues, you may notice that the question, "Who am I?" loses urgency. Not because it is answered, but because it is no longer oppressive. Identity becomes contextual. You are who you need to be in each moment without insisting on permanence. This is freedom. Not freedom from self, but freedom from fixation on self. The softened ego also allows grief. You can feel loss without being defined by it. You can mourn without collapsing into identity. This capacity deepens resilience. Resilience does not come from hardness. It comes from flexibility. A rigid structure breaks under pressure. A flexible one bends and returns. The ego softens because it learns it does not need to control everything to survive. Awareness can hold experience. Presence can meet difficulty. The ego can rest into this support. This resting reduces anxiety. You stop scanning constantly for threats to your identity. Life feels less like a test and more like a process. Softening is gradual. It happens through thousands of small moments. Each time you pause instead of react. Each time you allow instead of resist. Each time you respond instead of defend. There is no ceremony, no finish line, just a steady easing. You become less certain but more grounded, less defined but more real. The self remains, but it is no longer armored. It can be touched, it can be changed, it can listen. This is why Buddhism does not aim to destroy the ego. Destruction would create fear and fragmentation. Softening creates integration. You do not lose yourself. You gain range, you gain responsiveness, you gain freedom from rigidity. The ego becomes a tool rather than a tyrant, a servant rather than a ruler. And from this place, the path continues with less struggle and more trust. You no longer need to disappear to be free. You need to become permeable. You are not broken. You are becoming. As the self softens and no longer needs to defend its edges, something else begins to loosen. The urge to explain, the need to define what you have been through, the quiet pressure to turn your inner changes into a story that makes sense to others and maybe even to yourself. At first, this urge feels harmless. Then it starts to feel heavy, and eventually it feels unnecessary. There is a moment on the path when you realize that something in you has changed, but you cannot point to a single event that caused it. No clear turning point, no dramatic realization, just a gradual shift in how you respond, how you listen, how you stay. This is often when the mind rushes in to build a narrative. It wants to say, "This happened because of that. I am who I am now because I went through this." Buddhism gently questions this impulse. Stories are useful. They help us communicate. They help us remember. But when it comes to inner transformation, stories can also become cages. They freeze a living process into a fixed explanation. They turn becoming into a finished account. The desire to narrate growth often comes from the same place as the old egoic rigidity. It wants coherence. It wants identity. It wants to be able to say, "This is who I am now." But when the self has softened, it no longer needs to be summarized. It can remain open. Transformation does not always announce itself. It does not always arrive with insight or clarity. Often it shows up as absence, less reactivity, less urgency, less need to be understood. These changes are difficult to put into words because they are not additions. They are subtractions. Silence becomes meaningful here, not the silence of withdrawal, but the silence of not needing to explain. When you stop narrating your inner life, you allow it to keep moving. You stop turning each shift into a conclusion. Buddhism places great value on direct experience. Not because words are wrong, but because words are always secondary. The moment you describe something, you are already one step removed from it. This distance matters when the transformation is subtle. Many people feel pressure to justify their pain, to explain what it taught them, to extract meaning so it looks purposeful. This pressure often comes from others, but it also comes from within. The belief that suffering must be redeemed by a story. But some changes do not need explanation. Some experiences do not need meaning assigned to them. They simply reshape you quietly. Buddhism allows this. It does not demand narrative closure. When you let go of explaining your growth, you stop rehearsing your past. You stop reliving moments to make them intelligible. You free energy that was tied up in interpretation. This energy returns to presence. Presence is where real change continues to happen, not in reflection alone, but in how you meet what is here now. Stories tend to pull you backward or forward. Silence keeps you here. There is also a subtle performative aspect to growth narratives. You may feel the need to present your transformation in a way that is acceptable, inspiring, or coherent. This performance can pull you away from honesty. You may emphasize certain aspects and hide others. Silence removes this pressure. Without a narrative, you are not responsible for explaining yourself. You are not required to package your experience for consumption. You can let it remain unfinished. This unfinished quality keeps it alive. Buddhism understands that truth is not always communicable. Some insights are experiential and cannot be transferred through language. Trying to explain them can flatten them. Silence preserves their depth. This does not mean you never speak about your journey. It means you are no longer driven by the need to. You speak when it serves connection, not when it serves identity. Transformation without narrative also protects against spiritual pride. When you stop telling the story of how far you have come, you stop comparing paths. You stop measuring depth. You remain a participant rather than an authority. This humility keeps learning active. You are not finished telling your story because the story is not finished. In fact, there may be no final version worth telling. The mind often wants to mark progress, to say, before I was this, now I am that. Buddhism loosens this binary. Change is continuous. There is no clean break, no clear before and after. Trying to narrate it creates artificial boundaries. These boundaries can become identities. You become the one who survived, the one who awakened, the one who healed. These identities may feel empowering at first, but they can harden. They can replace one fixed self with another. Silence allows identity to remain fluid. You are not pinned to a version of yourself that once made sense. You can continue to evolve without contradicting a story you told. There is also safety in silence. When transformation is fragile, explaining it too soon can expose it to misunderstanding. Words invite interpretation. Interpretation invites judgment. Silence allows integration to complete itself. This is why many Buddhist traditions emphasize retreat, solitude, and quiet practice. Not to escape the world, but to allow deep changes to settle without interference. Integration happens in stillness. Narrative often rushes integration. You may try to explain an insight before it has been embodied. This can create confusion. You may believe you have changed more than you have, or judge yourself when behavior does not align with the story. Without narrative, there is less pressure to be consistent. You allow yourself to contradict yesterday's understanding. You allow learning to continue. Silence also deepens listening. When you are not rehearsing your story, you hear others more clearly. You respond to what is present, rather than filtering through your experience. This strengthens connection. There is a kind of healing that happens when you stop explaining yourself. You no longer need to be understood to feel valid. You no longer need to prove that your pain mattered or your growth is real. It simply is. This can feel unsettling at first. The story gave you a sense of grounding. Letting it go may feel like losing something, but what you lose is not meaning, it is control. Control over interpretation, control over how others see you, control over your own image. Buddhism sees this loss as freedom. Transformation without narrative does not mean forgetting the past. It means not living inside it. The past becomes a reference, not a residence. This shift changes how you relate to memory. Memories arise, but they do not demand explanation. They are allowed to be what they are. This reduces rumination. Silence also reveals what cannot be spoken because it has not resolved. Some experiences are still unfolding. Narrating them prematurely freezes them. Silence gives them room. This room allows emotions to move without being fixed into meaning. You may feel grief without needing to explain it. You may feel joy without announcing it. This simplicity is stabilizing. Buddhism teaches that clinging causes suffering. Clinging to stories is a subtle form of attachment. You cling to interpretation. You cling to coherence. Letting go of narrative loosens this attachment. This does not mean rejecting language. It means using it lightly. Words become tools rather than containers. As the need to explain fades, something else becomes possible, a direct relationship with experience. You stop asking what this means and start asking how this feels, how this moves, how this passes. This immediacy brings relief. You are no longer living one step removed, you are here. Transformation continues in this quiet way, not because you are tracking it, but because life keeps shaping you. You do not need to monitor it. You participate. There is also trust here. Trust that growth does not require narration to be real. Trust that healing does not need witnesses to be valid. Some of the deepest changes will never be noticed by others. They may not even be noticed by you until long after they have occurred. This does not make them less real. In fact, unnoticed change is often the most stable. It is not maintained by self-image, it is lived. Silence protects this kind of change. It allows it to root deeply. This is why Buddhism does not emphasize testimony. You are not required to declare your awakening. You are invited to live it, quietly, consistently, without spectacle. Living without narrative also softens regret. You stop replaying scenes to extract lessons. You allow the past to be complex, unresolved, human. This reduces self-criticism. You also stop demanding that pain be meaningful. Some pain does not resolve into insight. Some experiences simply shape you without explanation. Allowing this is a form of compassion. Transformation without narrative respects mystery. It acknowledges that not everything needs to be known or shared. Mystery is not a gap to fill. It is a space to honor. This respect for mystery deepens humility. You accept that you do not fully understand yourself. You remain open, curious, alive. As this openness stabilizes, you may find that words return naturally, not as explanation but as expression, not as justification but as connection. You speak from presence, not from identity. You share without defining. You communicate without concluding. This is a different relationship to language. It is lighter, more playful, less invested, and when silence returns, you are not afraid of it. You know that silence is not absence, it is fullness without form. The deepest healing often happens here, in the absence of commentary, in the space where experience is allowed to be what it is without being turned into a story. You stop narrating your becoming, you let it continue, and in that letting something settles. Not clarity in words, but clarity in being. You are not required to explain your growth, you are allowed to live it, quietly, fully, and without conclusion. You are not broken, you are becoming. As silence becomes more comfortable and the need to explain fades, another quiet frustration often appears. A familiar one. You notice the same challenges returning, the same insights resurfacing, the same themes cycling through your life again and again, and a doubt whispers, "Am I going nowhere?" This doubt misunderstands how learning actually works. There is a strong belief that growth should always move forward, that revisiting the same lesson means failure to progress. Buddhism sees repetition differently, not as a loop you are trapped in, but as a spiral that goes deeper each time it turns. Repetition is built into life. Breathing repeats, seasons repeat. The body renews itself through cycles. No one calls these stagnation. They are processes of maintenance and refinement. Inner growth follows the same logic. When a lesson returns, it is not because you ignored it, it is because you are ready to meet it from a new place. Each repetition happens under different conditions, with different awareness, with different capacity. What looks the same on the surface is not the same internally. The mind wants novelty. It wants the feeling of advancement, new ideas, new insights, new practices. Repetition feels dull by comparison, but depth rarely feels exciting. It feels familiar, subtle, quiet. Buddhism does not prioritize novelty. It prioritizes understanding, and understanding matures through repeated contact. The first time you encounter a lesson, it may remain conceptual, the second time, emotional, the third time, embodied. Each pass reveals a new layer. Take patience, for example. You may understand it intellectually. Later, you practice it under mild stress. Later still, you are tested under real pressure. Each repetition refines your relationship to patience. None of these stages cancel the others. They build on each other. This is why Buddhist practice often feels repetitive. Sitting again, breathing again, observing again. The repetition is intentional. It allows insight to sink below the level of thought. The belief that repetition equals failure comes from a goal-oriented mindset. You expect to graduate from lessons, to check them off. Buddhism challenges this. It sees life as an ongoing curriculum without a final exam. Revisiting the same emotional patterns, the same relational challenges, the same inner tensions is not a sign that you are stuck. It is a sign that these areas are central to your path. They return because they matter. Each return gives you a chance to respond differently. Even a small difference counts. A shorter reaction time, a softer inner voice, a quicker recovery. These shifts are easy to miss if you are looking only for dramatic change. Repetition also builds humility. You stop expecting mastery. You accept that some lessons accompany you for life. This acceptance reduces frustration. You work with what is present instead of wishing it away. Buddhism teaches that clinging creates suffering. Clinging to progress is a subtle form of this. When you demand constant forward movement, repetition feels threatening. When you release this demand, repetition becomes instructive. There is also compassion in repetition. You learn to be patient with yourself. You stop scolding yourself for not being done. This patience creates a supportive environment for deeper change. Repetition reveals where understanding is still partial. You may think you have forgiven someone until a similar situation arises and resentment returns. This does not mean forgiveness failed. It means it was incomplete. The return offers an opportunity to deepen it. In this way, repetition is diagnostic. It shows you where work remains, not as criticism, but as guidance. Buddhist teachings often emphasize practice over insight. Insight can be sudden, practice is repetitive. Practice integrates insight into daily life. Without repetition, insight remains abstract. Repetition also trains the nervous system. Calm responses are learned through repeated exposure. You cannot think your way into stability. You must experience it again and again until it becomes familiar. This is why old fears may resurface even after understanding their origins. The body learns through repetition, not explanation. Each time you stay present with fear without fleeing, the body learns safety. The same is true for compassion. Feeling compassion once does not make it stable. Practicing it repeatedly does. Each encounter strengthens the capacity. Repetition also dissolves pride. You stop believing that awareness exempts you from difficulty. You remain grounded. This grounding keeps practice honest. Many people abandon paths because they feel bored. They mistake boredom for stagnation. But boredom often arises when the mind no longer receives stimulation. Beneath boredom, something deeper is happening. When novelty fades, you are left with what is essential. Repetition strips away distraction. It forces you to meet the same material without the excitement of discovery. This meeting is uncomfortable, but it is where real work happens. Buddhism calls this the long path. Not dramatic, not glamorous, steady, reliable. Repetition also builds trust. You see that even when lessons return, you are not undone. You handle them better. You recover faster. This trust reduces fear of recurrence. Fear often drives the desire to move on quickly. You want to escape discomfort permanently. Buddhism shows that escape is not required. Familiarity reduces threat. When a lesson becomes familiar, it loses power. Not because it disappears, but because it no longer overwhelms. This familiarity is earned through repetition. Repetition also reveals impermanence. Each time a lesson returns, it does so differently. Conditions change, you change. This variation shows that nothing is static, even within repetition. This understanding prevents despair. You stop telling yourself that nothing ever changes. You see subtle evolution. Buddhist practice often uses the same teachings repeatedly, not because there is nothing new to say, but because each hearing lands differently. A teaching heard 10 years later is not the same teaching. Your life is the same themes return because you are different each time. Repetition also allows compassion to deepen. You recognize how long it takes to change. You extend this patience to others. You stop expecting quick resolutions. This patience reduces conflict. You meet others where they are, not where you think they should be. You recognize repetition in them as well. The Dharma of repetition also teaches commitment. You continue even when it feels ordinary. This commitment builds resilience. Repetition is where discipline becomes devotion, not forced, but chosen. You return because you trust the process. Buddhism does not promise novelty, it promises depth. Depth is not achieved by constant change, it is achieved by staying. Staying with the same practice, staying with the same questions, staying with the same challenges. Each stay refines perception. You notice subtler details. You respond with greater sensitivity. Over time, repetition becomes comforting. The familiar lesson no longer triggers despair. It signals an opportunity to deepen. This shift changes your relationship to difficulty. You stop asking why this again. You start asking how this now. The now matters. Each repetition is unique in time. Treating it as identical to the past obscures this uniqueness. Repetition also reduces urgency. You stop racing to finish. You accept that some lessons unfold over decades. This acceptance brings peace. Buddhism honors slow ripening. It does not rush insight. It allows wisdom to mature naturally. The mind often wants closure. Repetition resists closure. It keeps the path open. This openness is not failure. It is freedom from finality. Revisiting lessons also builds compassion for your earlier selves. You see how far you have come, even if the lesson remains. You stop dismissing past effort. This compassion integrates your history rather than rejecting it. The Dharma of repetition teaches you how to live without demanding resolution. You learn to coexist with ongoing learning. This coexistence is stability, not the absence of challenge, but the ability to meet it repeatedly without collapse. Repetition also reveals what truly matters. Superficial concerns fade. Core lessons remain. These core lessons shape character. Character is not built through novelty, it is built through repetition. Each time you choose awareness over reaction, you reinforce a direction. This reinforcement accumulates. Eventually, repetition transforms into embodiment. The lesson no longer feels like a lesson, it feels like a way of being. This embodiment is quiet, it does not announce itself, it is lived. The repetition that once frustrated you becomes the ground of trust. You know you can meet what arises. You stop fearing return, you stop measuring progress by disappearance, you measure it by depth. And depth reveals itself not through change of content, but through change of relationship. The same lessons return, but they no longer define you, they refine you. This is the Dharma of repetition, not stagnation, deepening. You are not stuck. You are learning how to stay, and in staying, you continue becoming. You are not broken. You are becoming. As repetition becomes familiar rather than discouraging, another quiet realization begins to form. The harder you tried to change before, the slower things seemed to move. The moments of real shift did not come from effort alone. They came when you stopped fighting. This realization feels almost wrong at first because everything you were taught says resistance is necessary. Buddhism points in the opposite direction. Acceptance is often misunderstood as giving up, as settling, as deciding nothing can change. But the acceptance spoken of here is something very different. It is the decision to stop arguing with what is already here. And paradoxically, this is what allows change to happen more quickly. Resistance consumes energy, not just mental energy, but emotional and physical energy as well. When you resist an inner state, part of you is constantly pushing against another part. This internal conflict creates tension. That tension slows learning. It tightens perception. It reduces flexibility. Radical acceptance releases this tension. When you stop trying to push an experience away, the system relaxes. And when the system relaxes, it becomes capable of reorganizing itself. This is not philosophy, it is observable. Think about moments when you were deeply anxious and tried to force calm. The anxiety likely intensified. But when you allowed the anxiety to be there without demanding its disappearance, it often softened on its own. Not instantly, but reliably. Acceptance removes the secondary suffering. The pain of pain is unavoidable at times. The pain of fighting pain is optional. When you drop the fight, what remains is workable. Buddhism does not ask you to like what is happening. It asks you to acknowledge it honestly. Acceptance is not approval. It is accuracy. You see clearly what is present without adding commentary about how it should not be this way. This clarity speeds change because it provides correct information. When you are resisting, perception is distorted. You see the emotion as an enemy. You exaggerate its threat. You narrow your options. Acceptance restores clarity. Non-resistance also builds trust. You learn that difficult states do not destroy you when you allow them. This trust reduces fear. Reduced fear allows exploration. Exploration leads to insight. Change driven by fear is unstable. It relies on constant vigilance. Change that arises from understanding is durable. It does not require constant effort to maintain. Radical acceptance also interrupts avoidance patterns. Many habits persist because they help you escape discomfort. When you stop needing to escape, the habit loses its purpose. It weakens naturally. This is why acceptance accelerates change. It removes the need for compensatory behavior. You are no longer trying to numb, distract, or control. You are present. Presence allows feedback. You feel the actual consequences of actions and thoughts. This feedback informs adjustment. Without resistance, learning becomes immediate. In Buddhist practice, this is why mindfulness is emphasized, not as a technique to achieve calm, but as a way to stay with what is happening. Staying allows experience to complete itself. Incomplete experiences repeat. Completed experiences integrate. Resistance prevents completion. You interrupt the process by pulling away. Acceptance allows the process to run its course. This applies to emotions, thoughts, and even identity shifts. When you resist who you are becoming, you slow the transition. When you allow the in-between, the new form emerges more naturally. Acceptance also changes how you relate to time. Resistance is impatient. It wants immediate results. Acceptance is patient. It allows organic pacing. This patience reduces pressure. Reduced pressure allows faster adaptation. The nervous system learns through safety. When you resist an experience, the body reads it as threat. When you accept it, the body reads it as safe enough to explore. Exploration leads to rewiring. This is why acceptance-based therapies are effective. They do not remove symptoms by force. They change the relationship to symptoms. The symptoms often reduce as a result. Buddhism understood this long before modern psychology. The instruction is simple but not easy. Stay, breathe, notice, do not add extra struggle. The paradox is that effortful change often reinforces the belief that something is wrong. Acceptance removes this belief. When you no longer see yourself as broken, the system stops defending against itself. Self-defense is costly. It uses enormous energy. When defense drops, that energy becomes available for growth. Acceptance also fosters compassion. You are kinder to yourself when you stop demanding immediate improvement. This kindness creates a supportive environment. Growth thrives in support, not punishment. Punishment creates compliance, not transformation. Acceptance creates understanding. Understanding leads to voluntary change. Radical acceptance also clarifies values. When you stop fighting what is, you can see what actually matters. You respond based on clarity rather than reactivity. This response is efficient. It targets the real issue instead of the symptom. Acceptance also dissolves shame. Shame thrives on resistance. It says this should not be here. Acceptance says this is here, and I can still be present. Shame loses its grip when it is not fed. Without shame, change becomes less dramatic. You stop oscillating between effort and collapse. You move steadily. Acceptance does not remove responsibility. It changes its tone. You take responsibility without hostility. You adjust without self-hatred. This tone matters. A hostile system resists learning. A supportive system adapts quickly. Radical acceptance also improves resilience. When you accept that difficulty will arise, you stop being shocked by it. You recover faster. You do not spiral. This faster recovery is a form of accelerated change. You spend less time stuck. You return to balance more quickly. Acceptance also sharpens discernment. You stop reacting blindly. You can choose where to apply effort. Effort becomes targeted rather than scattered. This targeting makes effort effective. You are no longer exhausting yourself fighting everything. You focus on what can actually change. In Buddhist terms, acceptance aligns you with reality. Fighting reality is exhausting. Aligning with it conserves energy. Energy conserved becomes energy available for insight. Acceptance also teaches humility. You accept limits, you accept timing. This humility prevents burnout. You stay in the process longer. Longer engagement leads to deeper change. Radical acceptance also reduces inner fragmentation. You stop rejecting parts of yourself. Integration increases. Integrated systems function better. Functioning improves without force. This is why acceptance is not passive. It is deeply active. It is the willingness to meet reality fully. When you meet reality fully, you receive accurate data. Accurate data leads to intelligent adaptation. Resistance blocks data. Acceptance opens it. Acceptance also changes motivation. You are no longer driven by fear of being wrong. You are guided by interest in what is true. Truth motivates naturally. It does not need pressure. This natural motivation sustains effort over time. Acceptance also creates emotional bandwidth. You are less overwhelmed. You can handle complexity. This capacity supports mature change. Mature change is not dramatic. It is consistent. Radical acceptance also allows grief. You grieve what is without rushing to replace it. This grief completes itself. Uncompleted grief repeats. Completion through acceptance prevents repetition. Acceptance also respects timing. Some changes require waiting. Forcing them early creates instability. Allowing them ripen creates stability. Stability allows further change. Acceptance also reduces comparison. You stop measuring yourself against ideals. You work with what is present. This focus improves effectiveness. Working with reality is faster than working against it. Acceptance also reduces cognitive load. You stop arguing internally. Mental clarity increases. Clarity supports insight. Insight supports change. The speed of change is not about intensity. It is about alignment. Radical acceptance aligns you with the actual conditions of your life. From this alignment, action becomes appropriate. Appropriate action produces results. These results are not always immediate, but they are reliable. Acceptance does not guarantee comfort. It guarantees honesty. Honesty accelerates learning. Learning accelerates evolution. This is the paradox. The moment you stop trying to force change, change begins to move on its own. Not because you gave up, but because you stopped interfering. Acceptance clears the path. You stop tripping over resistance. You stop dragging shame. You stop fighting yourself. What remains is movement. Quiet, steady, real. You are not stuck because you accept yourself. You move because you accept yourself. This is how non-resistance becomes the engine of transformation. This is how acceptance accelerates change. You are not broken. You are becoming. As acceptance begins to loosen, the inner struggle and change starts to move on its own. Another realization quietly comes into view. The question is no longer how to fix yourself or how to change faster. The question becomes simpler and more unsettling. Who is this self that has been changing all along? When you look closely, what you thought was solid starts to feel provisional. Supportive, yes. Necessary, yes, but not permanent. Identity often feels like who you are. Your personality, your roles, your history, your coping styles, your reactions. You may have spent years trying to improve these, heal them, or defend them. Buddhism invites a gentler and more accurate way of seeing. Identity is not your foundation. It is your shelter. A shelter is built for conditions. It protects against weather. It keeps you safe during storms, but it is not who you are, and it is not meant to last forever. When conditions change, shelters change. When storms pass, you step outside. Personality traits often develop as responses to early environments. You become quiet because loudness was unsafe. You become helpful because approval meant survival. You become independent because relying on others led to disappointment. These traits are not flaws, they are weatherproofing. They helped you live. Trauma responses work the same way. Hypervigilance, emotional numbness, people-pleasing, withdrawal. These are not defects in your character. They are intelligent adaptations to overwhelming conditions. They are structures built quickly to keep you standing when the ground was unstable. The problem begins when these shelters are mistaken for permanent architecture. When you believe that who you had to become is who you must always be. This belief creates rigidity. You defend traits that no longer serve you. You cling to roles long after their purpose has passed. Buddhism does not ask you to demolish identity. It asks you to understand it. When you understand identity as temporary shelter, something softens. You stop attacking it. You stop worshipping it. You begin to relate to it with respect and flexibility. This shift matters deeply. When you see identity as permanent, any threat to it feels existential. Criticism hurts more. Change feels dangerous. Loss feels annihilating. But when identity is seen as provisional, experience becomes workable. You can adapt without losing yourself. Shelters are built to be functional, not beautiful. Some parts may be awkward, some may be overbuilt, some may leak. Judging a shelter for not being perfect misses its purpose. It kept you alive. It allowed you to grow. Gratitude replaces shame when you see this clearly. Buddhist teachings on non-self are often misunderstood as denying identity. In truth, they deny permanence, not function. You still have a name. You still have preferences. You still have habits. But you no longer mistake these for essence. Essence in Buddhism is not a thing. It is awareness itself, that which knows experience. Shelters exist within awareness. They are not awareness. When awareness identifies completely with shelter, fear arises. Fear of collapse. Fear of exposure. Fear of weather returning. This fear keeps shelters rigid. It prevents renovation. Acceptance allows renovation. You do not tear down the shelter in a storm. You wait. You notice which walls are no longer needed, which supports are too heavy, which doors need opening. Identity changes naturally when safety increases. When the nervous system learns that danger has passed, defenses relax. This relaxation is not forced. It is biological, psychological, somatic. Many people try to force identity change by adopting new labels: healed, awakened, strong. This is another shelter, sometimes helpful, sometimes limiting. Buddhism encourages you not to settle too quickly into new structures. Roles also function as shelters, being the responsible one, the funny one, the broken one, the strong one. Roles organize relationships. They make interactions predictable. But when roles harden, they limit expression. You stop being able to respond freshly. Seeing roles as temporary allows play. You can step into them when useful and step out when they restrict. This flexibility reduces resentment. You are no longer trapped by expectations, including your own. Trauma responses deserve particular care. When people try to eliminate them aggressively, they often re-traumatize themselves. Buddhism encourages respect. These responses protected you when you needed them. They may still be protecting you in subtle ways. Healing does not mean erasing these responses. It means updating them, letting them know the conditions have changed. This update happens through experience, not argument. When you feel safe enough to soften, identity shifts on its own. You may find yourself reacting differently without effort, less guarded, less reactive, more spontaneous. This is not because you fixed yourself, it is because the shelter is no longer under constant threat. Seeing identity as shelter also reduces comparison. Shelters differ because storms differ. Judging yourself against someone with a different history makes no sense. Your structure reflects your weather. This understanding brings compassion toward yourself, toward others. You stop assuming people choose their traits freely. You recognize adaptation. Compassion does not mean accepting harm. It means understanding origin. From this understanding, boundaries can be set without hatred. Identity as shelter also explains why change can feel scary, even when it is positive. Leaving a shelter exposes you. Even if the weather is clear, vulnerability feels risky. Buddhism encourages gradual exposure. You step out when ready. You return when needed. There is no requirement to abandon shelter completely. Some parts remain useful, some traits continue to serve. The key is knowing you are not the structure. This knowing creates freedom. You can renovate without panic. You can let parts fall away without collapse. The mind often wants a new permanent identity once the old one loosens. Buddhism cautions against this. Any identity, no matter how refined, becomes a shelter again. Useful, but temporary. Freedom lies not in having no shelter, but in not mistaking shelter for home. Home, in Buddhist terms, is presence, awareness that remains whether shelter stands or falls. When you rest here, identity becomes lighter. You still show up, you still act, you still care, but you are less burdened by maintaining an image. This lightness changes relationships. You listen more. You defend less. You adapt more easily. Conflict becomes less threatening. Identity as shelter also reframes shame. Shame often arises when you judge your shelter for being inadequate. When you see it as survival-based, shame dissolves. Respect takes its place. Respect allows integration. You no longer exile parts of yourself. You understand their function and allow them to soften naturally. This softening is not loss, it is maturation. As shelters loosen, you may feel periods of disorientation. Who am I without this role, without this response? Buddhism treats this not as crisis, but as transition. Transitions are uncomfortable. They involve exposure, but they also allow growth. You may notice that identity becomes more contextual. You respond differently in different situations without feeling fake. This is responsiveness, not inconsistency. A rigid identity insists on sameness. A flexible one allows appropriateness. Appropriateness is wisdom, acting in accordance with conditions rather than image. This wisdom reduces suffering. You are no longer forcing yourself into shapes that no longer fit. Seeing identity as temporary shelter also reduces fear of loss. When roles change or fall away, you do not disappear, you adjust. This adjustment is not passive, it is intelligent. You retain what serves and release what burdens. Buddhism encourages this discernment, not clinging, not rejecting, understanding. When identity is no longer defended as essence, curiosity returns. You explore who you are becoming without needing certainty. This exploration keeps the path alive. You are not trying to arrive at a final self. You are learning how to adapt with care. Shelters will continue to be built and dismantled throughout life. New storms arise, new needs appear. This is natural. Suffering comes from believing the current shelter is permanent, or that you are the shelter. Freedom comes from knowing you are the one who can build, inhabit, and leave shelters as needed. This knowing does not make you rootless, it makes you resilient. Resilience does not come from rigidity, it comes from flexibility. Identity as temporary shelter teaches this flexibility deeply. You stop asking, "Who am I really?" and start asking, "What is needed now?" This question aligns you with life rather than image. Life is not static. Neither are you. You do not need to demolish yourself to grow. You need to recognize what you built to survive, and then allow it to evolve. Your personality is not a prison. Your trauma responses are not life sentences. They were shelters. They did their job. You can thank them. And when the weather changes, you can step outside. You are not broken. You were protected, and now you are becoming. As the shelters of identity loosen and no longer feel like solid ground, a strange quiet often follows. The old labels fall away. The familiar roles no longer fit, and instead of clarity, there is space. For many people, this space feels frightening. For Buddhism, it is a sign of depth. There comes a moment on the path when you cannot honestly say who you are anymore. Not because you are lost, but because the answers you once used no longer feel true. This moment is often mistaken for collapse. It is described as a crisis, a failure, a breakdown of self. But from a deeper view, it is something else entirely. It is the courage to remain without a mask. Not knowing who you are feels uncomfortable because identity has always functioned as orientation. It tells you how to act, what to expect, where you belong. When that orientation dissolves, the mind searches desperately for replacement. It wants a new name, a new story, a new certainty. Buddhism invites you to resist that rush. This resistance takes courage, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind. The courage to stay present without definition, to allow the sense of self to remain open rather than rushing to close it again. In many cultures, identity loss is treated as pathology. You are expected to know who you are at all times, to have a coherent narrative, to present consistency. Spiritual maturity challenges this expectation. It recognizes that rigid identity is not stability. It is limitation. When you no longer cling to fixed self-definitions, you are not empty. You are available to respond rather than perform, available to learn rather than defend, available to change without betraying yourself. This availability often arrives after deep inner work, after acceptance has softened resistance, after shelters have been seen as temporary. The ground beneath you shifts, and what remains is awareness without a script. This state can feel like floating, like being between worlds. The old self is gone, the new one not yet formed. The mind calls this danger. Buddhism calls it openness. Openness is uncomfortable because it removes certainty. You cannot predict yourself as easily. You cannot rely on habitual reactions. But this unpredictability is not chaos. It is responsiveness. Responsiveness is a sign of maturity. A mature system does not rely on rigid rules. It responds to conditions. When identity loosens, responsiveness increases. Not knowing who you are also dissolves comparison. Without a fixed identity, there is no one to measure against others. Competition loses meaning. You stop asking whether you are ahead or behind. You are simply here. This simplicity is deeply grounding. Paradoxically, when identity dissolves, presence strengthens. You are less preoccupied with self-image and more attuned to experience. The fear around identity loss often comes from the belief that without identity, you will disappear. Buddhism shows that awareness remains. You still function, you still care, you still act. The difference is that action arises from the moment rather than from a role. This shift is subtle but powerful. You respond because something is needed, not because it fits your image. This reduces inner conflict. You no longer have to choose between being authentic and being appropriate. Authenticity becomes responsiveness. The quiet courage of not knowing also dismantles pride. Pride relies on a stable identity. When identity is fluid, pride has nothing to attach to. This does not make you passive. It makes you honest. Honesty here means admitting that the self is not a finished product, that it changes with conditions, that it cannot be summarized fully. This honesty is freeing. Many people try to replace old identities with spiritual ones, the mindful one, the awakened one, the healer. These identities can be just as limiting. Buddhism cautions against this substitution. Any identity, spiritual or not, can become a cage. Not knowing protects against this. When you refuse to settle into a new label, you remain open to further learning. You avoid the trap of spiritual finality. This openness also deepens compassion. When you do not know who you are less likely to assume you know who others are. Judgment softens, curiosity grows. Curiosity is a sign of vitality. It keeps perception fresh. It allows you to meet people and situations without preconceived conclusions. Identity loss also reveals how much energy was spent maintaining a sense of self. When that effort relaxes, energy becomes available. You may feel more present, more spacious, even if you feel less certain. This energy supports deeper awareness. You notice subtler shifts. You listen more carefully. You react less automatically. The mind often tries to frame identity loss as regression. It says you should have answers by now. Buddhism reframes this. Not knowing is not regression. It is advanced honesty. Children ask who they are. Adolescents experiment with identity. Many adults stop questioning and settle into definitions. Spiritual maturity reopens the question, not out of confusion, but out of clarity that previous answers were incomplete. This reopening requires trust. Trust that you do not need to know who you are to live well. Trust that presence is enough. This trust grows through experience. You see that even without a fixed identity, you can navigate life. You can make decisions. You can relate. You can care. Decision-making changes in this state. You are less guided by what aligns with your identity and more by what aligns with values. Values are more stable than identity because they are relational rather than definitional. Values like kindness, honesty, and care do not require a fixed self. They guide action without defining who you are. This is a more flexible orientation. Not knowing who you are also allows grief. You may grieve the loss of certainty, the loss of a clear narrative. Buddhism allows this grief. It does not rush you to replace what was lost. Grief completes the transition. It honors what identity provided without clinging to it. As grief passes, curiosity returns. Who might I be without this story? This question is not anxious. It is open. Open questions keep the path alive. Closed answers end it. The quiet courage of not knowing also reduces fear of change. When you are not attached to a fixed self, change does not threaten your existence. It becomes part of the process. This reduces anxiety around aging, loss, and transition. You adapt more easily because you are not defending a particular version of yourself. Identity loss also clarifies what is essential. Without labels, what remains? Presence, sensitivity, care. These qualities do not depend on identity. They arise naturally. This realization shifts motivation. You are less driven to become someone and more interested in being present. Presence becomes the practice. Presence does not require identity. It requires attention. Attention reveals impermanence. Thoughts arise and pass. Emotions shift. Roles change. Awareness remains. Resting in awareness provides stability that identity cannot. Identity changes. Awareness observes. This observation is not detached, it is intimate. You feel fully without being defined. The courage to not know also invites humility. You accept that you do not have the final word on yourself. This humility keeps learning active. Learning without identity is less defensive. You can receive feedback without feeling attacked. You can adjust without losing face. This adaptability improves relationships. You are less reactive, more responsive, more present. Not knowing also reduces inner conflict. When you are not trying to live up to an image, you stop arguing with yourself. Decisions feel simpler. You act based on what feels true now. This simplicity is not simplistic. It is grounded. The mind may still crave definition at times. This is natural. Buddhism does not demand permanent openness. It allows movement between shelter and exposure. Sometimes you need identity, sometimes you need openness. Maturity is knowing when to use which. The quiet courage lies in not panicking when identity loosens, in trusting the process, in staying present. Many people retreat at this stage. They rebuild identity quickly to escape discomfort. Buddhism encourages patience. The discomfort is temporary. The openness is valuable. This openness allows deeper insight. You see how identity was constructed, how it was reinforced. This insight prevents future rigidity. You become skilled at holding identity lightly. You can step into roles when needed and step out when not. This flexibility is freedom. Freedom does not mean having no self. It means not being trapped by one. The quiet courage of not knowing who you are is a form of trust. Trust in awareness, trust in life, trust in process. This trust is not naive. It is informed by experience. You have seen that clinging creates suffering. You choose openness instead. Openness feels risky because it removes guarantees, but it also removes prisons. When you stop demanding an answer to who you are, you gain access to how you are, how you show up, how you respond. How becomes more important than who, how you listen, how you speak, how you act. These are alive in the moment. They do not require a label. This shift marks maturity. Not because you have transcended selfhood, but because you have learned not to cling to it. The quiet courage of not knowing is not emptiness, it is spaciousness. In this space, growth continues naturally. You do not force direction. Direction emerges. You are no longer driven by identity, you are guided by presence. This guidance is subtle, it does not shout, it whispers through attention. And as you learn to listen, the need to know who you are fades. You do not disappear, you become available to life as it is. This availability is strength. This is not crisis, this is clarity without conclusion. You are not lost, you are open, and in that openness, becoming continues. You are not broken, you are becoming. As the need to define yourself loosens and the courage to remain open grows, another question quietly rises. If you are no longer clinging to who you are, why does pain still appear? Why does suffering remain, even when awareness has deepened and understanding has matured? The answer is not what most people expect. It is not that something is wrong, it is that something is still forming. Suffering is usually treated as a problem to solve or a flaw to eliminate. Buddhism offers a more unsettling and more compassionate view. Some suffering exists not because you lack strength, wisdom, or insight, but because compassion has not yet completed its work. Pain can remain where empathy has not fully arrived. This does not mean suffering is good or necessary forever. It means suffering has a function beyond punishment or failure. It points to places where the heart has not yet learned how to include. Empathy is not automatic. It is learned through contact, through vulnerability, through being touched by experience rather than protected from it. Until empathy matures, suffering persists as a kind of signal, not a moral signal, but a relational one. Much of human pain comes from separation, feeling alone in experience, feeling unseen, feeling misunderstood. Even when you intellectually understand suffering, if it is still held in isolation, it continues. Compassion forms when isolation dissolves. Early in life, many people learn to survive by closing parts of themselves. Emotions are hidden, needs are suppressed, pain is endured silently. These strategies work for survival, but they interrupt the development of empathy toward oneself. Without self-empathy, pain becomes harsh and overwhelming. Buddhism teaches that compassion begins inwardly, not as indulgence, but as recognition. When pain is met with curiosity instead of rejection, empathy starts to grow. Until that happens, suffering remains sharp. This is why insight alone does not end suffering. You may understand impermanence, non-self, and acceptance, yet still feel pain deeply. Understanding prepares the ground. Empathy completes the work. Unfinished compassion often shows up as self-criticism. You judge your pain instead of meeting it. You analyze instead of feeling. You explain instead of accompanying. This creates distance. Distance sustains suffering. Empathy closes that distance. It does not fix pain, it sits with it. This sitting changes the quality of experience. Pain held with empathy softens. Pain held without it hardens. Many people mistake empathy for agreement or weakness. Buddhism does not. Empathy is strength. It requires presence. It requires staying with discomfort without turning away. Suffering persists where presence has not yet been possible, where the heart still protects itself by distancing. This protection is understandable. It formed to keep you functioning, but over time, it becomes limiting. Empathy dissolves this limitation gradually. You learn to stay present with your own pain, the way you might stay present with someone you love. You do not rush. You do not judge. You do not demand resolution. This practice feels unfamiliar because most people were not taught to meet pain this way. They were taught to endure, escape, or overcome. Empathy offers a fourth option: accompany. Accompaniment changes everything. Pain that is accompanied no longer needs to shout. It no longer needs to escalate to be noticed. It trusts that it will be met. This trust is not conceptual. It is felt. The nervous system relaxes when it senses empathy. This relaxation allows processing. Processing allows integration. Integration reduces suffering. This is not quick work. Empathy matures slowly. It deepens through repeated contact. Each time you meet pain without resistance, compassion grows. Each time you turn away, the work remains unfinished. This is why suffering often returns in similar forms, not because you failed, but because empathy was partial. Each return is an invitation to deepen it. Buddhism understands compassion as wisdom in action, not sentimental kindness, but clear seeing that includes feeling. Wisdom without compassion becomes cold. Compassion without wisdom becomes overwhelmed. Suffering arises when these are out of balance. Unfinished compassion also explains why some people carry pain that does not seem to belong to the present moment. Old grief, old fear, old shame. These emotions were not fully met when they arose. They wait. They wait not for explanation, but for empathy. For someone finally to stay. This someone is often you. Developing empathy for your own suffering is not selfish. It is foundational. When you learn how to stay with your pain without abandoning yourself, you develop the capacity to stay with others. This is why compassion for all beings often arises after personal struggle, not before. Before suffering, empathy is abstract. After suffering, it is embodied. Buddhism calls this the cracking open of the heart. Not dramatic, not poetic, practical. The heart becomes more permeable because it has been touched. Suffering that has been met with empathy becomes wisdom. Not because it disappears, but because it teaches you how to relate. Suffering that has not been met becomes bitterness or numbness. This is a crucial distinction. Two people can experience similar pain. One becomes closed, the other becomes compassionate. The difference is not strength, it is whether empathy was allowed to form. Empathy also has layers. You may feel empathy for yourself intellectually, but not emotionally. You may allow some feelings, but not others. Suffering persists in the places still excluded. Buddhism encourages total inclusion, not indulgence, but honesty. Every emotion deserves presence. None deserve exile. Exiled emotions create suffering because they operate in isolation. Included emotions integrate. This inclusion does not mean being overwhelmed, it means being available. Availability builds capacity over time. Empathy also transforms how you see others suffering. You stop judging, you stop comparing, you recognize pain regardless of its source. This recognition softens your responses. The world feels less hostile when empathy matures. Not because harm disappears, but because you no longer face it alone. Unfinished compassion often shows up as urgency. You want pain to stop quickly. This urgency is a sign that empathy is not yet stable. Stable empathy is patient. It does not rush. Patience is not passive. It is attentive. It stays. This staying is what suffering has been waiting for. When you finally stay, something shifts. Not dramatically, quietly. The pain feels less sharp, less personal, more workable. This does not mean life becomes easy. It means life becomes shared. Shared pain is lighter than isolated pain. Empathy also dissolves shame. Shame survives on isolation. When pain is met with compassion, shame loses its power. This is why suffering often decreases when shared with someone who truly listens. Buddhism teaches you to become that listener for yourself. This inner listening is transformative. You stop abandoning yourself in moments of difficulty. You become a stable presence. Stability does not come from eliminating pain. It comes from being able to stay with it. Suffering as unfinished compassion also reframes meaning. You no longer ask why this is happening to you. You ask how this is asking to be met. This question shifts attention from explanation to relationship. Relationship heals, not by fixing but by connecting. Empathy also reveals interdependence. You see how your pain connects to others' pain. You recognize shared vulnerability. This recognition deepens care. Care that arises from empathy is not forced. It is natural. This natural care extends outward. You respond differently to others, more gently, more patiently, more realistically. Your suffering becomes a teacher, not because it was good, but because it showed you how much empathy matters. When empathy matures, suffering changes form. It may still arise, but it does not dominate. It passes through a field of care rather than a field of resistance. This field of care is compassion. Compassion does not erase pain, it transforms the relationship to it. This transformation is the beginning of liberation, not liberation from experience, but liberation within experience. The Buddha taught that suffering ends when ignorance ends. Ignorance here does not mean lack of knowledge, it means lack of intimacy, lack of empathy. When intimacy forms, suffering no longer stands alone. This is why some pain persists until empathy arrives, not because you deserve it, not because you failed, but because compassion was still learning how to hold it. You are not meant to conquer your pain, and you are meant to meet it. When you do, suffering fulfills its function and begins to soften. Not because it was solved, but because it was finally understood. This understanding is not intellectual, it is relational. And in that relationship, something heals. You are not broken, your compassion was still forming, and as it forms, becoming continues, quietly, gently, truthfully. As compassion finishes what suffering began, something else often follows that few people talk about honestly. You might expect relief, calm, a sense that everything finally settles. But instead, life can feel more unstable than before. Relationships strain, old comforts stop working. The ground under your sense of self shifts again. This is not a mistake. This is often what awakening actually looks like at first. There is a popular image of enlightenment as permanent peace, a calm smile, a life untouched by disturbance. Buddhism does not promise this as the starting point. In fact, early awakening is more likely to feel like disruption than serenity. It removes illusions before it offers ease. Awakening means seeing clearly, and clear seeing does not always feel good. When you begin to see how much of your life was built on avoidance, compromise, or unconscious habit, comfort is disturbed. You can no longer unsee what you see. This creates tension between awareness and the structures of your life. Old comforts often depend on unconsciousness, distraction, routine, agreement not to look too closely. Awakening disrupts these agreements. Things that once soothed you may start to feel empty. Conversations may feel shallow. Activities may feel misaligned. This loss of comfort can feel like loss of self. Relationships are especially affected. When you change internally, relational dynamics shift. You may become less willing to play certain roles, less patient with dishonesty, less able to ignore what feels wrong. This can confuse or threaten others. It can also confuse you. People may say you have changed, sometimes with concern, sometimes with resistance. Awakening removes your ability to maintain harmony at the cost of truth. This does not make you better than others. It makes you less able to pretend. This can feel lonely, not because you are superior, but because your inner reference point has moved. You are no longer guided primarily by approval or familiarity. You are guided by alignment. Alignment can disrupt belonging before it creates a deeper form of it. Self-image also destabilizes. You may no longer recognize yourself in the mirror of your own expectations. The traits you once relied on may no longer feel authentic. Confidence may waver. Certainty may disappear. This is not regression, it is reorganization. Awakening dissolves false stability. It removes the sense of control that came from not seeing clearly. What replaces it at first is not peace, but honesty. Honesty can be unsettling. Buddhism recognizes this phase and does not rush it. It understands that the nervous system needs time to adjust. Seeing truth faster than you can integrate it creates strain. This strain is not failure. It is a sign that awareness is ahead of habit. Enlightenment is not a single event. It is a process of alignment catching up to insight. Early insight exposes misalignment. Later practice integrates it. This is why awakening can initially increase sensitivity. You feel more, you notice more, you react more strongly at first. Old numbness fades before new stability forms. This can feel overwhelming. Many people panic here. They assume something has gone wrong. They try to retreat back into comfort. Buddhism encourages patience. This phase passes when integration is allowed. Integration requires gentleness. You cannot force peace. You must allow the system to reorganize at its own pace. Pushing for calm often recreates suppression. Awakening also disrupts ambition. Goals that once motivated you may lose their appeal. You may question paths you committed to. This questioning can feel destabilizing, but it is necessary. You cannot continue walking toward what no longer fits. This does not mean you abandon responsibility. It means you renegotiate it from alignment rather than obligation. The destabilization of awakening also reveals grief. Grief for lost illusions, for relationships that cannot continue unchanged, for identities that no longer hold. This grief is real. Buddhism allows it. Grief is not a sign you are wrong to awaken, it is a sign you cared. Awakening also removes certain protections. You may find it harder to ignore injustice, harder to numb pain, harder to tolerate harm. This can make the world feel harsher at first, but this sensitivity is not weakness. It is awareness before resilience has fully formed. Over time, resilience grows. The early stages of awakening often involve oscillation, moments of clarity followed by confusion, openness followed by contraction. This is normal. The system is learning a new way of being. Peace does not arrive all at once. It arrives in layers, first as honesty, then as stability, finally as ease. Many people give up during the honesty phase. They mistake discomfort for failure. Buddhism emphasizes that this discomfort is transitional. Awakening also challenges social identity. You may no longer fit neatly into groups that once defined you. This can create a sense of exile, but it also creates space for more authentic connection. Authentic connection often comes later. It cannot be forced. It arises when you stop performing. Self-image instability is especially uncomfortable. You may not know how to describe yourself anymore. Titles feel hollow, labels feel limiting. This is a sign that identity is loosening. Loosening identity creates freedom, but first it creates uncertainty. Uncertainty feels unsafe until trust develops. Trust develops through experience. You learn that you can function without rigid self-definition. You learn that presence is enough. Awakening also reveals internal conflict. Parts of you may resist change. Old habits may fight back. This inner tension can feel chaotic. Buddhism does not interpret this as backsliding. It sees it as negotiation. Old patterns do not disappear instantly. They need reassurance. This reassurance comes from compassion, not force. Awakening without compassion becomes harsh. Compassion softens the transition. Relationships that survive this phase often deepen. Those that do not may fall away. This loss is painful, but clinging would create more suffering. Awakening also changes how you experience pleasure. Superficial pleasures may lose intensity. Deeper joys may take time to appear. This gap can feel bleak, but it is temporary. As sensitivity recalibrates, joy returns in quieter forms, less dramatic, more stable. Early awakening also brings ethical sensitivity. You may feel troubled by actions you once ignored. This sensitivity can feel burdensome. Over time, it becomes clarity. You act more consistently with your values. This consistency brings peace. The discomfort of awakening often comes from living between worlds. The old way no longer fits. The new way is not yet embodied. This in-between is uncomfortable. Buddhism honors this liminal space. It does not rush you through it. Awakening also removes excuses. You see more clearly where choice exists. This can feel heavy. Responsibility increases. But responsibility here is not blame. It is responsiveness. You respond because you see. Seeing deeply is tiring at first. You may need more rest, more solitude. This is not withdrawal. It is integration. Integration takes time. Awakening unfolds at different speeds for different people. Comparison here is unhelpful. Peace that comes too quickly is often suppression. Real peace is earned through honesty and integration. The early destabilization of awakening is a sign that illusions are dissolving. Illusions once provided comfort. Without them, things feel raw. Rawness is temporary. It gives way to steadiness. Steadiness is not numbness. It is the ability to stay present without being overwhelmed. This steadiness develops gradually, through repeated contact with reality. Awakening is not an escape from life. It is deeper entry into it. This entry feels disorienting because you are no longer buffered by unconsciousness. But what you gain is freedom from false stability. False stability eventually collapses anyway. Awakening allows collapse to happen consciously. This conscious collapse is less destructive. It makes room for rebuilding on truth. Rebuilding takes time. It is uneven. It requires patience. Buddhism emphasizes the long view. Awakening is not a finish line. It is a beginning. The peace people associate with enlightenment comes later. It is not imposed. It emerges. It emerges from living honestly. It emerges from allowing destabilization to do its work. It emerges from letting comfort be replaced by alignment. Alignment is quieter than comfort, but more stable. Awakening destabilizes because it removes what no longer belongs. What remains is real. Real life is not always peaceful, but it is workable. As awareness matures, peace becomes less dramatic and more reliable, not because nothing disturbs you, but because you are no longer disturbed by disturbance. This is not indifference, it is resilience. The early chaos of awakening is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that truth is reorganizing your life. You are not losing yourself, you are losing illusions. And in their absence, something more stable slowly forms. Not overnight, but honestly. You are not broken, you are awakening. And awakening at first is rarely peaceful. As the shock of awakening settles and the rawness begins to find its footing, another question quietly emerges. Not about truth, not about insight, but about direction. You may notice that practice has become central to your life, yet something feels slightly off. You are calmer in some ways, but distant in others. Clearer inside, yet strangely disconnected from the world around you. This is where a subtle line appears, and it matters more than it seems. Spiritual practice can heal, and it can also hide. The difference is not obvious at first. Both can look peaceful, both can sound wise, both can offer relief. Buddhism speaks directly to this tension through what it calls the middle way. Not as moderation in a shallow sense, but as a deep discernment between presence and avoidance. After awakening disrupts comfort and identity, it is natural to seek stability. Practice can provide that. Meditation, teachings, rituals, and silence can calm the nervous system and offer meaning. But when the ground is still shifting, There is a temptation to use these tools not to meet life, but to step away from it. Escaping does not always look dramatic. It can look serene. It can sound like acceptance. It can feel like transcendence. But beneath it, there is often a tightening, a narrowing of engagement, a subtle withdrawal from the messiness of human life. Healing moves toward life. Escaping moves away from it. The difference lies in contact. Healing increases your capacity to stay present with difficulty, complexity, and relationship. Escaping reduces contact under the banner of peace. You may feel less disturbed, but also less available. Buddhism never taught withdrawal from life as liberation. The Buddha himself returned to the world after awakening. He engaged, he taught, he listened. He dealt with conflict, illness, loss, and misunderstanding. Awakening did not remove him from life. It rooted him more deeply within it. The middle way is about balance, but not balance between extremes on the surface. It is balance between clarity and compassion, solitude and relationship, inner work and outer responsibility. When this balance tips too far in one direction, practice loses its grounding. One sign of escaping is using spiritual language to dismiss unresolved pain. Saying things like, everything is empty, so it doesn't matter, or this is just ego, instead of meeting grief, anger, or fear directly. This is not wisdom. It is avoidance dressed in insight. Another sign is a shrinking of empathy. If practice makes you less patient with others' struggles, less tolerant of emotion, or more detached from suffering, something is misaligned. True healing expands empathy even when it increases sensitivity. Escaping often arises from exhaustion. After intense destabilization, the system wants rest. This is understandable. The problem arises when rest turns into withdrawal, and withdrawal turns into identity. You may begin to identify as someone who is above certain concerns, beyond certain emotions, or uninterested in ordinary life. This identity feels safer than uncertainty, but it creates separation, and separation always brings suffering, even if it is quiet. The middle way does not reject retreat or solitude. It values them deeply, but it asks what they are serving. Are they helping you return to life with more clarity and care, or are they becoming a place to hide from unresolved engagement? Healing often feels harder than escaping because it requires staying in conversation, staying in responsibility, staying in ambiguity. Escaping offers immediate relief. Healing offers lasting integration. One way to discern the difference is to notice what practice does to your relationships. Healing practice makes relationships more honest, even if more challenging. Escaping practice makes relationships feel like interruptions. Another marker is how you relate to discomfort. Healing increases your ability to be with discomfort without needing to explain it away. Escaping reduces discomfort by avoiding situations that bring it up. Buddhism does not advocate comfort at all costs. It advocates clarity with compassion. Sometimes clarity means engaging in difficult conversations. Sometimes compassion means feeling pain rather than bypassing it. The middle way also applies to inner work. There is a point where constant self-examination becomes self-avoidance. You analyze endlessly but do not act. You reflect deeply but do not risk change. Healing moves insight into behavior. Escaping keeps insight in abstraction. Action here does not mean force. It means participation. You show up. You respond. You allow yourself to be affected. Escaping often carries a subtle fear of intimacy. Intimacy exposes vulnerability. Practice can become a way to remain composed rather than open. This composure is not peace, it is armor. The Buddha's teaching on the middle way emerged from his own extremes. Before awakening, he tried indulgence. Then he tried severe asceticism. Neither brought freedom. Freedom came from balance rooted in wisdom. This balance is dynamic, not fixed. At different times, you may need more inner work or more outer engagement. The middle way is not a rule, it is a continuous inquiry. A useful question is whether practice is making you more human or less, more patient or more distant, more grounded or more abstract. These answers change over time, and honesty is required. Healing does not eliminate struggle, it changes how you relate to it. Escaping tries to eliminate struggle by narrowing life. Healing expands your capacity, so struggle is no longer overwhelming. Another sign of escaping is spiritual perfectionism, the belief that you must maintain a certain state to be valid. This leads to suppression. Healing allows fluctuation. You are not required to be calm at all times. You are required to be honest. Honesty can be uncomfortable. It may reveal anger, desire, confusion, or grief that contradicts your spiritual self-image. The middle way asks you to include these without shame. Inclusion is healing. Exclusion is escaping. The middle way also protects against burnout. When practice is used to escape, energy drains over time. You become brittle. When practice supports healing, energy renews. You feel more alive, even when life is challenging. Buddhism emphasizes right effort, not too tight, not too loose. Too tight creates tension and self-judgment. Too loose creates drift and avoidance. Right effort feels steady, sustainable. This steadiness shows up in daily life. You handle ordinary tasks with care. You engage with responsibilities without resentment. You allow pleasure without guilt. Escaping often devalues the ordinary. Healing honors it. Washing dishes, listening to a friend, paying bills. These are not distractions from practice. They are practice. The middle way dissolves the split between spiritual and mundane. Life becomes the field of awakening, not something to transcend. This does not mean you stop questioning. It means questioning includes action. You test insights in relationship. You see what holds up. Healing requires feedback. Escaping avoids feedback. When practice isolates you from others' responses, it loses grounding. Another sign is how you respond to conflict. Healing allows conflict to be worked through. Escaping avoids it under the guise of peace. But unaddressed conflict does not disappear. It goes underground. The middle way encourages skillful engagement, speaking when needed, listening when needed, stepping back when needed. There is no single correct posture. This discernment develops over time. Mistakes are part of it. You may escape at times. You may over-engage at others. The path is forgiving. What matters is willingness to notice, to adjust, to return to balance. Healing practice leaves you more present in your body. Escaping often creates disconnection. You may feel spaced out, detached, or numb. Buddhism values embodiment. Awakening includes the body. The middle way integrates insight with sensation. You feel emotions fully. You inhabit your physical life. You do not float above it. This integration supports resilience. You can face difficulty without collapsing or withdrawing. Escaping often feels peaceful at first, but brittle. Healing may feel messy, but robust. The middle way also respects timing. You do not force engagement before you are ready. You do not hide indefinitely. You move in rhythm. This rhythm is personal. There is no template. Comparison is unhelpful. The Buddha emphasized compassion as a measure of practice. If compassion is shrinking, something is off. If compassion is deepening, even amid difficulty, practice is aligned. Compassion includes yourself. You do not shame yourself for wanting relief. You simply notice how you seek it. Noticing is enough to shift direction. The middle way is not about doing everything perfectly. It is about staying oriented toward life rather than away from it. Healing is messy. It involves setbacks. Escaping avoids mess. The middle way stays. Staying does not mean enduring harm. It means remaining engaged where growth is possible. Over time, this engagement brings a quieter peace, not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of belonging to life as it is. When practice supports this belonging, it is healing. When it undermines it, it is escaping. The difference is subtle. It requires ongoing attention, but you can feel it in the body, in relationships, in motivation. Healing feels alive. Escaping feels diminished. The middle way keeps you honest. It allows awakening to mature. It ensures that insight does not pull you away from life, but deeper into it. You are not here to disappear. You are here to participate. And when practice supports participation, it becomes a bridge rather than a refuge. A bridge between seeing and living, between insight and action, between becoming and being. You are not broken. You are learning how to stay. As practice finds its balance and the line between healing and escaping becomes clearer, another subtle pattern can appear. It does not feel harmful. In fact, it feels responsible, even wise. You tell yourself you are still working on things, still processing, still becoming. And without realizing it, life is placed on hold. The idea of being on a healing journey can be deeply supportive at first. It gives language to pain. It creates permission to slow down. It offers hope that things can change. But when the journey itself becomes an identity, healing quietly turns into postponement. This trap does not announce itself as avoidance. It presents itself as depth. You may spend years preparing to live rather than actually living. Always almost ready, always nearly healed, always one insight away from fully engaging. Buddhism is clear about this danger. Attachment does not only form around pleasure or pain, it also forms around improvement, around progress, around the idea of becoming someone better in the future. When healing becomes something you must finish before you are allowed to live, it stops being healing. It becomes a delay mechanism. The language of the journey can keep you oriented toward the future indefinitely. You frame your life as something that will begin once enough inner work is done. Relationships, risks, creativity, joy are deferred. Not rejected outright, but postponed. This postponement often feels justified. You tell yourself it is responsible to wait until you are more stable, more aware, more healed. But stability does not arrive all at once. Awareness is not a finish line. Healing does not conclude with a certificate. Life happens now, not after you are ready. Attachment to healing often arises from fear. Fear of repeating mistakes, fear of being hurt again, fear of harming others. These fears are understandable, but when they dominate, healing becomes a shield rather than a bridge. Buddhism does not teach healing as preparation for life. It teaches healing as participation in life. Insight is meant to be lived, not perfected in isolation. When you are attached to healing, every experience is evaluated. Is this too much for me right now? Does this align with my process? Am I ready for this? These questions can be useful, but when they become constant, they narrow life. You begin to relate to yourself as fragile, as someone who must be protected from complexity. This belief reinforces itself. The less you engage, the more intimidating engagement feels. The journey identity also creates endless self-monitoring. You watch your reactions closely, not to learn, but to assess readiness. You track progress. You measure setbacks. Life becomes a project rather than an experience. Projects end. Life does not. This is where the trap tightens. You become very good at understanding yourself, but less practiced at living with others. You know your patterns, but you have fewer chances to respond differently in real situations. Growth becomes theoretical. Buddhism emphasizes embodied wisdom. Wisdom that shows up in action, in relationship, in difficulty. This kind of wisdom cannot develop fully in reflection alone. Attachment to healing also changes how you relate to pain. Pain becomes something that must be processed before you move forward. But some pain only resolves through movement, through action, through contact. Grief, for example, does not always dissolve through analysis. Sometimes it needs laughter, work, love, risk. Healing that excludes these becomes incomplete. The journey trap can also create a subtle superiority. You see yourself as someone doing the work, while others are asleep or unhealed. This separation is not intentional, but it isolates you. Isolation slows healing. Another sign of attachment to healing is when language replaces experience. You talk about boundaries, triggers, and integration, but avoid situations that would actually test them. This avoidance feels wise, but it keeps skills unpracticed. Buddhism values practice in the midst of life, not as exposure therapy, but as integration. You learn by engaging, not by waiting for perfect readiness. Healing as identity often resists endings. You are always in process, always unfolding. This sounds open-ended, but it can become a way to avoid commitment. If you are always becoming, you never fully arrive anywhere. Arrival does not mean completion. It means presence. You show up even when unfinished. Life does not ask you to be healed. It asks you to be here. Attachment to healing can also distort time. The past becomes a constant reference point. You organize your present around what happened before. This can be necessary for a while, but eventually it keeps you anchored backward. Buddhism encourages learning from the past without living inside it. When healing becomes attachment, the past dominates. When healing becomes wisdom, the past informs but does not control. Another subtle trap is waiting for permission. You wait for an inner signal that says you are ready. But readiness often comes after action, not before it. Courage is built through movement, confidence through contact, not the other way around. This does not mean pushing yourself recklessly. It means noticing when caution has become a habit rather than a response to real danger. Attachment to healing often carries an unspoken belief that life is dangerous. That engagement will overwhelm you. Buddhism does not deny danger, but it teaches discernment. Not all discomfort is harm. Avoiding all discomfort in the name of healing prevents growth. The journey trap can also keep you focused inward excessively. Self-awareness is valuable, but when it becomes self-absorption, it narrows perspective. You lose touch with the larger world. Buddhism emphasizes interdependence. Healing happens in relationship, not in isolation. Service, contribution, and care for others are not distractions from healing. They are expressions of it. When you remain too focused on your own process, you may miss opportunities to connect, to help, to be helped. These opportunities often accelerate healing more than introspection. Attachment to healing can also create fear of joy. You may hesitate to enjoy life fully, worrying that joy is premature or distracting. This hesitation keeps life muted. Joy is not a reward for healing. It is part of being alive. Buddhism does not teach postponement of life until suffering ends. It teaches engagement with life as suffering and joy coexist. Another marker of the trap is rigidity around practices. You believe certain routines are necessary to maintain progress. Disruption feels threatening. This rigidity creates anxiety. True healing increases flexibility. You can adapt practices to circumstances. You are not dependent on them for stability. The journey trap also affects decision-making. You delay choices, waiting for more clarity, but clarity often emerges through commitment. You learn by choosing and adjusting. Avoiding choice in the name of healing can lead to stagnation. Buddhism teaches right action, action aligned with awareness. Not perfect action, responsive action. Attachment to healing also keeps you identified with woundedness. You see yourself primarily as someone recovering. This identity can become familiar and safe, even when it no longer reflects your reality. Letting go of the healing identity can feel like betrayal of your past pain. But it is not. It is honoring the work that has already been done. You are allowed to move on, even if some pain remains. The trap tightens when healing becomes endless preparation. You read, reflect, meditate, but avoid risk. Risk is where life unfolds. This does not mean ignoring limits. It means questioning whether limits are current or inherited. Buddhism values discernment over rules. Discernment asks what is appropriate now, not what was necessary then. Living does not require being fully healed. It requires being willing to learn through experience. Healing that delays living creates a false order, as if healing comes first, then life. In reality, they happen together. When you live while healing, healing stays grounded. When you heal without living, healing becomes abstract. Attachment to healing also increases pressure. You feel responsible for constant improvement. This pressure creates fatigue. Letting go of the journey identity allows rest. Not rest from life, but rest within life. Rest does not mean stopping growth. It means stopping the obsession with growth. Buddhism teaches non-attachment even to wholesome states. Healing is wholesome. Attachment to it creates suffering. Freedom comes from holding healing lightly. You care, but you do not cling. When you release the need to constantly be on a journey, you may feel exposed. Without the narrative of process, you face life directly. This exposure is vulnerable, but it is real. Reality is where wisdom functions. Living while unfinished is the practice. Showing up while imperfect. Loving while still learning. Acting while still uncertain. This is not recklessness, it is humility. Humility accepts that you will make mistakes, that you will learn as you go, that healing continues through living. The journey trap dissolves when you realize you do not need to arrive to begin. You are already here. Life is already happening. Healing is not something you complete so you can live. Healing is what happens when you live honestly. When you stop postponing, energy returns, curiosity returns, engagement returns. You do not abandon healing, you stop hiding behind it. You step into life with what you have, and what you have is enough to begin. You are not behind. You are not unready. You are alive, and living is not the reward for healing. Living is the ground where healing continues. You are not broken. You are becoming. And becoming does not require waiting, as life is no longer postponed and you step into it without waiting to be finished. Something unexpected often rises. It is quiet. It does not demand attention the way pain once did. It does not feel like failure, and yet it carries weight. It is the feeling of loss that comes not from falling apart, but from moving forward. When you become someone new, something old must be left behind. Not because it was wrong, but because it no longer fits. This leaving is rarely dramatic. There is no ceremony, no clear goodbye. There is just a soft ache that appears when you notice you no longer respond the way you used to. You no longer want what once defined you. You no longer recognize certain versions of yourself. This ache is grief. Grief is usually associated with death. But this kind of grief is more subtle. It is the grief of identity change, the grief of outgrowing selves that once kept you safe, the grief of realizing that you cannot return to who you were even if you wanted to. Buddhism does not overlook this grief. It understands that becoming involves loss, even when the change is healthy, even when it is chosen, even when it brings relief. Growth is not only expansion, it is also relinquishment. Old selves were not illusions. They were real responses to real conditions. They carried you through confusion, danger, longing, and survival. They deserve respect. When they fall away, something inside you remembers what they did for you. Grief honors that memory. Many people try to skip this grief. They rush to identify with the new self, the healed self, the awakened self, the stronger self. But skipping grief creates fragmentation. The old selves do not disappear. They linger, unheard, creating tension beneath the surface. Mourning is not clinging. Mourning is acknowledging that something mattered, that it served a purpose, that it had a life of its own. Buddhism allows this acknowledgement without attachment. This is a delicate balance. You grieve without trying to go back. You remember without rebuilding. You thank without re-entering. The grief of becoming someone new often shows up unexpectedly. You may feel sadness without a clear reason, nostalgia for ways you once coped, tenderness toward versions of yourself you once criticized. This sadness does not mean you made the wrong choice. It means you are integrating change. Integration requires time. You cannot move forward fully while parts of you are still unacknowledged. Grief completes transitions. It allows the nervous system to register that a chapter has closed. Without grief, you may carry unconscious loyalty to the past. You may sabotage new ways of being out of respect for old ones. Mourning frees you from this conflict. Buddhism teaches impermanence, not as detachment from feeling, but as intimacy with change. Everything that arises passes, including selves, including identities, including coping strategies. Feeling the passing is part of wisdom. This grief is subtle because society does not recognize it. There are no rituals for becoming different, no shared language for outgrowing identities. You may feel alone in it. Buddhism offers companionship here. It names this experience as part of the path. The grief of becoming is also mixed with relief. You may feel lighter and sad at the same time. This complexity can be confusing. The mind wants clarity. The heart holds contradiction. Holding contradiction is maturity. You do not need to resolve it. You allow joy and sorrow to coexist. This coexistence deepens compassion. Old selves often formed around pain. Letting them go can feel like betraying that pain. As if moving forward means minimizing what you endured. Grief reassures you that nothing is erased. Your story is not denied, it is honored. Mourning also allows forgiveness. You forgive yourself for what you did not know, for choices made under pressure, for ways you coped that you no longer need. This forgiveness is gentle. It does not require justification. Without grief, self-forgiveness remains shallow. With grief, it becomes embodied. You feel the weight of what was carried. You feel the relief of putting it down. Buddhism does not rush this process. It understands that change happens faster than integration. Insight can outpace the heart. Grief allows the heart to catch up. You may notice resistance to grief, a belief that sadness means weakness, or that moving forward should feel only positive. This belief creates inner pressure. Buddhism releases this pressure by allowing full emotional range. Grief is not regression. It is completion. The subtle grief of becoming someone new also shows up in relationships. You may mourn dynamics that no longer exist, conversations that no longer resonate, ways of connecting that no longer feel honest. This loss can feel isolating. You are not wrong for missing what you no longer want. Missing does not require returning. It requires honoring. Some relationships end, some change, some grow deeper. Grief allows you to accept these shifts without bitterness. Grief also protects against arrogance. When you mourn who you were, you remain connected to your humanity. You do not look down on your past self. You bow to it. This bowing creates continuity. You are not cutting yourself off from who you were. You are integrating. Integration is the opposite of clinging. Clinging freezes identity. Integration allows movement. The grief of becoming someone new is often quiet. It does not demand attention. It surfaces in moments of stillness, in pauses, in unexpected tears. Buddhism encourages allowing these moments rather than distracting away from them. Allowing grief does not mean indulging it endlessly. It means letting it pass through. Grief that is felt moves. Grief that is avoided stagnates. Stagnant grief can masquerade as doubt. You question your direction. You wonder if change was a mistake. Often this doubt is not about the future. It is about unacknowledged loss. When you name the loss, doubt softens. You can move forward with clarity rather than confusion. Mourning old selves also releases fear of future change. When you know you can grieve without collapsing, change becomes less threatening. You trust your capacity to let go. This trust is essential for ongoing becoming. Life will continue to reshape you. Each reshaping involves loss. Grief becomes a skill rather than a crisis. Buddhism treats grief as wisdom in motion. It teaches you impermanence through feeling, not theory. You do not just understand that things change, you feel it. Feeling impermanence does not make you detached. It makes you tender. You care deeply because you know nothing lasts. This tenderness enriches life. You show up more fully. You appreciate moments without trying to freeze them. The grief of becoming someone new also reveals gratitude. You may feel thankful for the ways you survived, for the strength you had when you needed it. This gratitude does not require staying the same. Gratitude and grief often travel together. One honors what was given. The other releases what is no longer needed. Old selves often carried burdens you no longer need to bear. Grief allows you to set them down with respect. This respect prevents inner conflict. You are not fighting your past, you are releasing it. The mind often wants to label grief as a problem. Buddhism sees it as a natural response to change. When change is conscious, grief follows. This grief is not endless, it comes in waves. Each wave marks another layer of transition. You may grieve not only who you were, but who you thought you would be. Dreams that no longer align, expectations that have softened. This grief is also part of becoming. Letting go of imagined futures creates space for real ones. Mourning does not mean clinging to the past. It means allowing it to pass fully. You do not carry it forward unfinished. Unfinished grief weighs you down. Finished grief frees energy. This energy returns as presence. You feel more grounded, more real, less divided. The subtle grief of becoming someone new often deepens compassion for others. You recognize how hard change is. You stop rushing people through their transitions. You offer patience. This patience enriches connection. You meet others where they are, not where you think they should be. Buddhism honors this patience. It does not demand speed. It values depth. Depth includes grief. As you allow grief, identity becomes lighter. You are less defined by what you were. You are not yet defined by what you are becoming. You rest in between. This in-between is fertile. It allows creativity. It allows honesty. It allows renewal. Grief does not stop you from living. It allows you to live without dragging the past behind you. You do not need to cling to old selves to honor them. You honor them by letting them go, by acknowledging what they gave, by carrying forward what is essential and releasing what is heavy. This is not loss without gain. It is transformation with tenderness. You are allowed to feel sad for who you were. You are allowed to feel relief at no longer being them. These feelings do not cancel each other. They complete each other. Becoming someone new does not require forgetting. It requires mourning without attachment. When grief is allowed, the path clears. You move forward unburdened, not because nothing was lost, but because what was lost was honored. You are not betraying your past, you are completing it. And in that completion, becoming continues, quietly, humanly, with depth. You are not broken, you are becoming. You were never meant to arrive at a final version of yourself. Every lesson you just moved through points to the same truth from a different angle. Discomfort was not a flaw, it was movement. Confusion was not failure, it was space. Repetition was not stagnation, it was depth. Grief was not weakness, it was integration. And healing was never a destination. It was a way of learning how to live. Buddhism does not ask you to erase who you are. It asks you to stop fighting what you are becoming. To see pain as information, not punishment. To see identity as something you inhabit, not something you are trapped inside. To understand that awakening does not always feel peaceful at first, but it always moves you closer to truth. If there is one thing to take with you, let it be this. You are not late. You are not failing. You are not unfinished in the wrong way. You are unfolding exactly as a human life does. If something in this series resonated with you, don't rush past it. Pause for a moment and leave a comment with one word that describes where you are right now. Not where you want to be, not where you think you should be, just where you are. Sometimes naming the moment is the first act of compassion. And if you want to keep exploring these ideas, slowly, honestly, without pressure, subscribe to the channel. These teachings are not about becoming someone else. They're about learning how to stay with yourself as you change. You are not broken, you are becoming.